A countless multitude of people gathered at the gates of the demonic Murim Alliance, also called the Demon Palace.
Of course, everyone was struck by the number of souls gathered, eager to get inside. However, such a gathering did not seem so surprising. After all, the palace accepted absolutely everyone, regardless of faction or sect affiliation. Any mortal possessing even a drop of potential could be taught forbidden demonic arts. Obviously, no sane person would want to miss such a rare opportunity to rise above the others. Amidst this rising crowd, many noticed a young man in snow-white robes standing out among the motley mass. Therefore, some immediately assumed, surely someone had passed into the other world. The old man's conjectures seemed very strange to his companion, since the competitions in the 10 demonic palaces had not even begun yet. How could someone have died prematurely?
However, the elderly man quickly realized. This boy was a young embalmer of corpses, preparing the dead for their final journey.
At that moment, the young man himself was intently gazing at the majestic walls of the demonic clan, towering before him like a fortress. His eyes flashed with a scarlet light under the sun's rays when the youth remembered his dear grandfather and vowed to carry the begun task to the very end, no matter what. The boy's name was Bu Yun Sol, a name given to him by his beloved grandfather, after he found the infant abandoned in a field amid the snowy wasteland. Thanks to the old man's guidance, the boy mastered the art of embalming dead bodies. However, their life was by no means easy. Because of the cursed profession, people often hated them both, avoiding them as if they were lepers. But the boy was neither worried nor saddened by this. He learned rapidly, absorbing knowledge, and could already, by corpses alone, unerringly determine what the deceased had done in life. For example, by the gait and well-developed leg muscles, one could conclude the deceased had devoted years to mastering the blade, and that means the dead man was a skilled swordsman who had learned the way of the sword. Grandfather always praised the boy for his sharp, perceptive gaze, for the heavens themselves had granted the grandson a rare gift, to see what is hidden from the eyes of ordinary mortals. No matter what harsh trials befell Bu Yun Sol, grandfather always remained by his side, protecting and guiding him. This continued until that fateful day came, turning the boy's whole life upside down. Late at night, the old man suddenly awoke in their crumbling hut from the sharp creak of flung-open windows. A fierce wind had broken out outside, causing even the bamboo in the grove to eerily creak under the gusts of the storm. Peering into the impenetrable darkness, the old man quickly realized he was clearly being sought by ill-wishers thirsty for blood. Good people would never appear so secretly in the middle of the night. Immediately, he hurried to shake the boy by the shoulder so that he would wake up from sleep at once. With a strained smile, grandfather suggested to his grandson to play an interesting game. He should try to portray a dead man as convincingly as possible, without giving himself away by a single movement. The old man also solemnly promised, if the boy did an excellent job this time, then grandfather would definitely buy him new clothes and a real sword, which the boy had dreamed of for so long. After these words, he carefully laid the grandson in a wooden coffin and began slowly closing the lid. Only at the end did the man, with a warm smile, ask Bu Yun Sol to try to prolong the game until dawn, not leaving earlier than necessary. Ignoring the surprise and bewilderment on the grandson's face, the old man hastily slammed the coffin shut, hiding the boy from prying eyes. Then he took out his long dusty blade, which he had not wielded for many years, and decisively flung open the door, stepping out to meet the danger. A stranger emerging from the darkness sarcastically praised the old man who had hidden from the world for so many years like the most despicable rat trembling in a hole. Only then did the unknown visitor, hiding his face under a hat, call the grandfather the demonic blade of all 8 branches, a legend about whom bloody legends were told. Outwardly the most ordinary peaceful embalmer. In reality, he was the legendary warrior named Bu Jian Yang. Obviously, the old man had not heard his real name for a long time since the days when he permanently left the position of deputy head of the palace, renouncing the past. However, the visitor was truly enraged that the famous warrior had refused a high position in order to earn a living by such a miserable and despicable craft. Therefore, the angry demon immediately furiously attacked the old man without hesitation. However, the man stopped the swift strike with astonishing ease, calmly explaining, he took up the work of an embalmer not at all to earn a living. No, he wished to repent for all the sins of the past, atoning for the bloody guilt before the world. In the end, the elder agreed without protest to give his life to the one who came for his tormented soul. But in return, he only asked to go far away from the house. After all, despite his bitter fate, the man did not want innocent people, unrelated to his sins, to suffer. The visitor eventually agreed to these fair conditions. Turning around, the demon began to slowly walk away, but as a farewell ordered, the old man must not even think about cowardly fleeing to save his worthless life. Only by the arrival of the long-awaited morning did the boy finally finish his agonizing game of the dead and struggled to get out of the cramped coffin. He simply could no longer endure the chilling cold inside. Although the boy longed to receive the promised form and sword, he was ready to give up the reward. Waiting was unbearable anyway. Moreover, it seemed strange that grandfather had disappeared somewhere. It was extremely unusual. He had never left during their games before. So Bu-Eun's soul initially assumed the clients had called Grandpa to prepare another deceased person. After that, the boy sighed bitterly, because people did not consider them human due to their cursed work as embalmers, defiling dead flesh. However, to his greatest surprise and horror, when the young man stepped into the yard, he immediately saw crimson traces of a recent fierce battle baked into the ground. Immediately after this heart-wrenching discovery, the boy felt something wrong, chilling the blood in his veins. Therefore, he immediately took off and ran wherever his eyes could see, not caring about the road. It is unknown how long he rushed headlong before he finally exhausted himself and stopped, gasping for breath. However, all the boy found at the end of the path was his beloved grandfather, who had been beaten to death by that demonic monster who knew no mercy. Of course, the terrified boy immediately rushed to the dying old man, who by that moment had lost both his hands, cut off in the fight. The boy desperately tried to understand what had happened to Grandpa and how he could help in any way. The elder, with a heavy, barely noticeable smile, apologized that it was time for him to leave this world. He asked his grandson not to abandon the embalmer's work even after his inevitable death, continuing the tradition. Because the man spoke with his last strength, he began choking on his own blood, bubbling in his throat. But despite the agonizing agony, Grandpa did not fall silent. He begged that the grandson should not even think about avenging him. Revenge would only bring sorrow and destruction. Then, for the first time in his short life, Bu-Eun's soul experienced a truly primal horror that chilled the soul. His eyes filled with a bloody light as he swore. He would not forgive those scoundrels who did such a thing to his only beloved person. The boy even wanted to follow his grandfather to the other world, to the realm of the dead. After all, the old man always repeated, there is no difference between hell and the world of people. Both are full of suffering. Therefore, the boy thought, it would be better to go to the underworld with the old man than to remain here completely alone, without a single kindred soul. The old man only smiled heavily and wearily. It seemed to him that it would be much easier to accept inevitable death and leave peacefully. But saying goodbye to Bu-Eun's soul turned out to be a painfully difficult and heavy trial. Still, the dying man had one last request to his beloved grandson. He wished for the boy to leave here as far as possible and never return. After that, the old man smiled one last time, confessing to the little one. He had been immensely happy all the time they stayed together, never parting. After these words, his body weakened and lifeless, and he immediately fell face down into the dirt, giving up his soul. In that nightmarish vision, the boy lost all his feelings, literally turning into a living dead man, devoid of emotions. He fully understood. The grandfather did not want revenge only because he desperately tried to protect Bu-Eun's soul from death. The boy felt unbearably sorry, because this time he could not listen to his grandfather's last will and fulfill the request. Staring at the mutilated body of the man, the youth quickly realized his hands were cut off in a single moment, with one powerful swing. Moreover, the cutting movement was made from top to bottom at a certain angle. Such a rare technique was not often found among warriors. During the penultimate attack, the killer changed the blade handling technique to also deprive the old man of his eyes. Obviously, such a strange and sophisticated sword technique could only belong to the demonic path, the forbidden style. Moreover, a person capable of inflicting such horrifying wounds has surely studied the deadly technique of Yogi Tianju, known for its cruelty. The man's body was in no less terrible condition. 93 wounds gaped on him, inflicted exclusively by the use of concealed weapons. Even the forbidden technique of the sky full of falling flowers can leave no more than 60 wounds at a time. It seemed that someone else was responsible for these injuries. Most likely, a rare technique was used, capable of delivering at least 100 strikes in a single moment, merged into one. Also, the young man carefully examined the tongue of the deceased old man. And here was the color of the lower part of the nails, blackened and swollen. Everything unmistakably indicated that the man had been struck by a deadly poison causing the rotting of flesh and blood, corroding the body from within. Therefore, the killer was a person from the demonic path, trained in the forbidden technique of yoga and possessing hidden weapons of the highest caliber, as well as using rare poisons that cause the flesh to necrotize. There were very few such skilled warriors in this vast world. You could count them on one hand. Therefore, Bu-Eun's soul was obliged to find this person, no matter what, even at the cost of his own life. Remembering this heartbreaking event now, the boy did not even notice how he began to cry uncontrollably right over the agreement paper he was holding in his hands. Of course, the guard's warriors were amazed by the boy's strange behavior, not understanding the reason for the tears. However, considering his young age, they thought he simply got scared when he saw the liability waiver agreement for the participant's life and health. Therefore, the stern man condescendingly recommended the boy to get lost if he was afraid to put his bloody fingerprint on the contract. But when the guard leaned closer to the guy, he noticed with surprise, despite the tears of sorrow blurring his eyes, the youth cold-bloodedly bit his finger, letting out scarlet blood. Immediately after that, he decisively placed the fingerprint on the paper without flinching. Recalling that cursed moment when his grandfather took his last breath, all Bu Eun-sol could say. Since then, his life began to fall apart like a shattered mirror. He was left with absolutely nothing except to step onto the demonic path of revenge, soaked in blood. Therefore, he came to this contest to begin his long-awaited vengeance, no matter what price he had to pay. The battle between two powerful forces, orthodox and unorthodox sects, as is known, lasted for long bloody years without abating. The orthodox sects thirsted to restore justice and administer judgment, uniting under the banners of the Murim Alliance. Meanwhile, the unorthodox sects concentrated around the sinister demonic palace, worshipping exclusively brute strength and the power of the strongest. For many years, a fragile balance was maintained between these opposing forces, preventing one side from destroying the other. But the orthodox sects desired to achieve greater power and complete supremacy. This aspiration led to the creation of elite posts of 18 great martial arts masters, known as Masters for the Greater Good, Warriors of Light. With the emergence of a new threat from the Murim Alliance, the demonic palace also decided to enhance its forces, unwilling to fall behind. Thus were chosen the legendary demonic masters, capable of resisting enemies. That is why a tempting offer was made, to select 10 geniuses for the palace and train them in forbidden martial arts, regardless of their origin or previous occupation. Of course, this inspiring news caused countless young men from all corners of the world to gather in one place to achieve the greatest success and glory. Finally, Bu Eun-sol decisively passed through the majestic main gates, immediately noticing many people curiously looking at him. Soon they all lost interest in the unremarkable boy and turned away. But the boy himself felt from some contenders a very impressive and sinister aura of power, radiating in waves. Surely among all these gathered people there would be at least one who was connected to the killer of his grandfather, directly or indirectly. What the young man knew for certain, the killer possessed such incredible fighting skill that the boy could not even imagine in his wildest dreams. To avenge such a devil in the flesh, Bu Eun-sol himself needed to become a true master of martial arts, reaching the heights of power. But now, having absolutely nothing behind him except hatred and determination, becoming one of the 10 demonic masters was his only chance to grow stronger and get closer to his goal. Finally, at this solemn moment, a respected old man with a piercing gaze stepped onto the platform accompanied by faceless guards. He majestically introduced himself to the assembled. His name was Ho Myung-gak, the chief instructor of the palace. He was also known by a fearsome nickname, the Golden Dagger with Bloody Eyes, striking terror into enemies. Of course, all the gathered youths immediately opened their mouths in genuine admiration. After all, they were given the rarest honor, to see with their own eyes the legendary figure of the Golden Dagger with Bloody Eyes. Ho Myung-gak angrily explained the rules. In this sacred place, 10 geniuses from various demonic sects scattered around the world would be chosen. Those few lucky ones who pass all the prepared trials with honor will be able to become worthy candidates for the place of one of the 10 legendary demonic masters. As the first trial, the martial arts masters of the demonic palace had to carefully test the abilities of the gathered youths, assessing their potential. Of course, none of those present could have guessed that the first trial would be so unexpected. Everyone was preparing for a bloody fight, honing their technique. But at that moment, the stern masters who had approached already began the inspection, methodically feeling their bodies as if they were cattle at a fair. In the end, those who passed the selection quickly calmed down, realizing their physical condition was quite good for training. But Bu Eun-sol became seriously worried, as his physical abilities were by no means at the best level. Years of working as an embalmer did not contribute to muscle development. The boy was worried that he would be sent away immediately, without even a chance to prove himself. But finally, one of the formidable masters approached him and began to feel his fragile body. However, obviously the experienced fighter immediately felt the young man's physical condition was in a terrible, deplorable state. Honestly, the warrior was in complete shock that this frail boy had even come here to participate in deadly competitions. However, his thirst for victory and determination could not be ignored. It literally radiated from every pore. Still, the master could not count on this burning fact alone to let the boy pass further in the selection. Therefore, passing by with a stone face, he went to check other, more promising fighters. In principle, the boy himself was not the least bit surprised by the circumstance that had arisen. All he had done in his short life was to care for lifeless corpses, preparing them for burial. So such a physical test was clearly beyond his capabilities. That was obvious. However, the boy sincerely believed this was far from the end of his thorny path to revenge. After the completion of the first brutal selection, the first dissatisfied with the testing results appeared, boiling with indignation. One young spearman angrily declared they were promised a fair competition, but in the end, they were given only a primitive test of physical abilities. Obviously, the warrior considered this an outrageous injustice, which caused a contemptuous smirk from the golden dagger. Ho Myung-gak patiently explained to the spearman, "When it comes to mastering martial arts, bones and muscles are the most important detail, the foundation of strength. This test was aimed at mercilessly weeding out those weaklings who cannot be taught forbidden arts." But at the same time, the boy dares to protest so boldly, without even passing the most basic elementary check. However, what angered Ho Myung-gak the most was something else. The spearman named Hek Ren-un was firmly convinced that all candidates had the sacred right to at least have the opportunity to fight and prove their worth. In the end, the instructor felt the full force of Hek Ren-un's rage. He began to be pressed to the ground by an invisible force, like a miserable insect under a boot. The legendary golden dagger towering over him ominously promised, in the second trial, those who can learn martial arts even without a worthy, strong body will be determined. The second trial, like the first, was to take place today without delay. From this moment, all students were granted the right to start fighting each other without mercy. The main condition: the trial would end only when there was just one survivor left, the last one standing. Of course, all the guys were shocked and stunned by the fact that they were forced to mercilessly kill each other, even though they were formally on the same side, serving the demons. But the spearman Hek Ren-un gripped his spear tighter in his hands, filled with iron determination. He knew perfectly well, if he was destined to kill, he would simply aim at the weakest opponents and start the bloody fight first, not giving them a chance to recover. First of all, the warrior decided to attack Bu-un's soul, whom he obviously considered the weakest link among all the contenders, which was not surprising, given his frail appearance and lack of musculature. Therefore, the spearman menacingly spun his deadly spear in the air, then threw it at the boy like lightning. However, it later turned out, this spear was actually intended for a completely different person standing nearby. The weapon struck the young warrior right in the belly, piercing through. The spearman grinned joyfully, anticipating he would finally be able to kill the first victim and begin his ascent. The unfortunate one only wheezed plaintively, desperately clutching the spear shaft and trying to pull it out of his bleeding body. But in the end, nothing could be done. Strength rapidly left the dying man. Therefore, the first fallen helplessly collapsed to the ground, bleeding profusely, the scarlet blood spreading in a puddle. Bu-un's soul quickly realized why the young man died so suddenly, not lasting even a minute. The spearman had managed to aim precisely between the ribs and pierced the heart with a single precise strike. After that, the villainously laughing murderer suggested to the other cowards to attack him all at once. Then they would die just as quickly and pitifully as that idiot who boldly dared to annoy him. Observing the daring antics of Hek Ren-un, the golden dagger realized. This guy decided to take the initiative and intimidate the others, but it turned out to be completely useless and foolish. Overall, the old man expected that among those gathered there would be plenty of worthless trash, unworthy of training. Obviously, the other masters fully agreed with Ho Myung-gak. After all, such behavior in that situation showed how dangerous you were. It was equivalent to drawing a huge target on your own back, attracting enemies. But still, his brazen act made the other frightened youths stir, breaking away from their places. Everyone immediately began to panic, not knowing what to do best. Because obviously, if everything continued in the same spirit, a real bloody massacre without rules would begin. In the end, one of the young men, mortally afraid that he might be killed first, suddenly betrayed his comrades and attacked the one standing nearby. However, he was promptly stabbed by another enemy who stealthily crept up behind him, taking advantage of the confusion. As a result, the arena was filled with genuine despair and a mad slaughter that overwhelmed everyone. Ho Myung-gak, cold-bloodedly watching this whole massacre, perfectly understood. The less these kids are accustomed to the sight of death, the easier the fear of death will paralyze their minds, depriving them of the ability to think rationally. However, unexpectedly, he noticed some very interesting specimens on the blood-stained arena standing out from the crowd. These young men also caught the close attention of the master responsible for testing the physical abilities of the candidates. The two unusual specimens turned out to be two guys who, despite all this bloody massacre around, calmly observed what was happening from the side, as if it did not concern them at all. Bu-un's soul did nothing because he perfectly understood. All these kids were simply fools, unable to think. They were so afraid of death that they simply decided to shut off their brains and act instinctively. And yet the golden dagger with bloody eyes clearly said, The trial will end only when there is one survivor. So the essence of the task was far from senseless killings, but survival at any cost. Of course, if you calm down and keep your wits about you, this task could be easily completed while conserving strength. So for the sake of his late grandfather, the boy solemnly promised he would definitely survive this insane slaughter, no matter what it took. At that moment, one of the fighters especially distinguished himself on the battlefield, skillfully wielding maces on long chains. However, after dealing with another unlucky opponent, he noticed a strange boy who was pitifully sneaking among piles of corpses. It seemed the unfortunate one was trying to hide among the dead bodies, avoiding the fight. However, Bu Yun-sol was not hiding at all. He was simply methodically analyzing the wounds left on the bodies of the fallen and trying to understand which technique had killed these people. This could be useful for survival. And now the sneaky agile fighter decided to kill this overconfident boy to remain the last survivor in this bloody massacre. But the boy managed to dodge the deadly blow at the last moment. However, he completely forgot about the wooden box behind his shoulders. So after a direct hit from the mace, the box shattered into tiny fragments, scattering across the ground. Noticing the contents of the box, the attacker only sneered contemptuously at Bu Eun-sol, considering him a pathetic dealer of funeral supplies, unworthy of attention. The boy himself hastily crouched to the ground to gather his precious belongings scattered everywhere. These things were incredibly dear to his heart. After all, he found them after saying goodbye to his grandfather and returning to the empty house. This was the very armor he so desperately wanted to obtain, as well as the beautiful blade promised by his grandfather. In the note attached to the gift, the man congratulated his beloved grandson on his birthday one last time and wished him happiness. Of course, now the crazed boy greedily looked around at his blade, ready to smear it in the blood of enemies just to take revenge. Seeing the fury and determination of Bu Eun-sol, the opponent immediately menacingly spun his deadly mace to attack and finish off the impudent one. He knew perfectly well the youth would not succeed in doing anything wielding such a weak short sword against a long weapon. But at that moment the second surviving contender arrived, who unexpectedly struck this impudent one with his swift blade. Immediately after, the stranger addressed Bu Eun-sol, thanking him for so successfully distracting the useless opponents, giving the opportunity to attack from behind. However, Bu Eun-sol paid absolutely no attention to his words, carefully examining the things he had brought from home. Therefore, the savior quickly concluded. Although the boy was quite quick and nimble, he had never trained in martial arts in his life. It was obvious. The warrior with the scar was fully aware. He could easily kill Bu Eun-sol with one strike at any moment. However, he did not manage to do anything, as another enemy had already sneaked up from behind, with whom he urgently had to deal, repelling the attack. At that moment, paying close attention to the boy with the scar on his face, Ho Myung-gak recognized his blade. So the Golden Dagger wanted to understand who this mysterious boy was, since he had inherited the legacy of once the greatest warrior of the past. The assistant immediately hurried to introduce the boy. His name was Nin Yoon-gan, and according to rumors, he found the instructions and sword left by the legendary master deep in the mountains, in a forgotten cave. Obviously, because the guy was self-taught, his techniques were still flawed and full of annoying gaps and shortcomings. But now he could literally be considered the unofficial student of the great master of the past, having absorbed the knowledge. Although his foundation was weak, he was a good candidate for the position of one of the 10 demonic masters. So even now, in this brutal trial, he could defeat all the other contenders. But the Golden Dagger considered it a huge unforgivable mistake to give such a legendary sword and martial art to novices like Nin Eun-gan. At least it was pleasing that among the testees, he was the strongest at the moment. However, the master rightly pointed out, there were still people in the arena who could hide great unexpected surprises without revealing their true strength. Bu Eun-sol, while Nin Eun-gan was distracted by another fight, continued methodically examining the corpses of the fallen. The slashing wound on one of them was quite rough and uneven, revealing the killer's inexperience. While the protagonist examined various wounds, studying the enemy's techniques, Nin Eun-gan had already dealt with all the remaining opponents, crushing them. He basically expected that Bu Eun-sol would remain the last opponent, and they would face off like this in a final one-on-one battle. Nin Eun-gan was well aware, if he killed this strange boy, he would definitely become a candidate for the position of one of the 10 demonic masters, achieving his goal. Therefore, beckoning the protagonist with his finger, the warrior asked him to attack first and demonstrate his pathetic skills. The protagonist was well aware. This opponent was the strongest of all the guys who were on the blood-stained arena on this fateful day. However, during all the time the guy calmly watched the battles from the side, he had already discovered all his weaknesses and flaws in technique. In the end, Bu Eun-sol with his short blade began to slowly approach the enemy, preparing for the fight. It was clear that Nin Eun-gan froze in anticipation, eager to see what this mysterious boy was capable of. In the end, the warrior attacked using sword techniques he had learned from the records left by the legendary master in the cave. All that remained for the protagonist was to clumsily dodge deadly blows, so new and new wounds appeared on his battered body. To an inexperienced observer, it might have seemed that Bu Eun-sol was panicking and unable to control himself, foolishly exposing himself to blow after blow. However, the golden dagger noticed something interesting. At the end of each strike, the boy slightly shifted to the side, as if analyzing the opponent's technique. In the end, in this cunning way, the boy managed to avoid receiving fatal wounds by dodging at the last moment. So, apparently, the youth simply managed to memorize the entire attacking pattern of the opponent by examining the corpses of other people killed by Nin Ungan earlier. Honestly, such astonishing observation deeply impressed the golden dagger. Soon Nin Ungan ran out of breath, stopping his furious attack and breathing heavily. And at that moment, Bu Eun-sol managed to calmly catch his breath, recovering his breathing. But still, the protagonist considered his opponent a rather pathetic fighter. After a whole series of attacks, he had not managed to take anything except a couple of pieces of flesh. With these bold words, he clearly provoked the enemy into making a mistake, throwing him off balance. The master noticed. The boy excellently dodged enemy attacks, as if dancing between blades. But a successful counterattack is a completely different matter. Right now, the young man was in a terrible, deplorable condition, bleeding. In such an exhausted state, it would be much harder for him to attack and strike himself. Now Ungan, coldly looking at the arrogant opponent, admitted. Before these insolent words, he still wanted to give the boy a chance to survive and surrender. But now he was completely convinced that one is literally begging him for a quick death. So he was not going to refuse the killing and attacked, giving it his all. Watching the enemy rapidly approaching, the boy perfectly understood he had only one single chance to attack and survive. Using the corpses left behind by Nin Ungan throughout the arena, he understood something important. His deadly attacks were always aimed at vital points of the body. In particular, the most important for him were the heart and the victim's head. That is precisely why, if a warrior is determined to kill the enemy for sure, he will aim exclusively at the upper part of the enemy's body, not wasting strength on anything else. And at this critical moment, the boy suddenly ducked, dodging a deadly attack by a hair. After that, he aimed at the enemy's vital point, using the last chance. He remembered the wise words of his grandfather. He explained that blood flow in the solar plexus is very difficult to control even for the most skilled martial arts masters. Therefore, even if an ordinary child hits this vulnerable spot with all their might, they can easily leave an adult unconscious, paralyzing them. For this reason, using his last feeble strength, the protagonist fiercely attacked. And in the end, with his short blade, he pierced his enemy's neck, cutting an artery with one precise movement. Obviously, after this deadly blow, Nin Ungan, flooding everything around with scarlet blood, died almost instantly, helplessly collapsing to the ground. The protagonist, with his last strength, rose to trembling legs and, looking at the golden dagger with bloody eyes, wanted to find out. Had he passed the test worthily? Of course, everyone present was absolutely surprised that Bu Eun-sol emerged as the winner. Even Ho Myung-gak placed much more hope on Nin Ungan's student because of his excellent physical condition and mastery of the blade. But still, the instructor ordered to beat the drums as a sign of the solemn completion of the second brutal test, after which he congratulated Bu Eun-sol on having passed this test, proving his worth. However, listening to the dull sound of the drum, Bu Eun-sol suddenly found himself somewhere in the dark corners of his memories, wandering in an absolutely white space without boundaries. The old man was looking for his beloved grandson, glancing around. Of course, the boy immediately ran joyfully to the man to greet him. However, the grandfather did not see him, which was extremely strange, considering that in this nightmarish vision his eyes were gouged out, gaping with empty voids. After this heartbreaking vision, Bu Eun-sol hastily came to his senses, awakening from oblivion. He found himself in a cramped ship cabin. In this room, besides him, there were many other fighters looking at him as if he were a madman who had lost his mind. Then the boy listened to the monotonous noise of the waves splashing outside the ship. Obviously, he lost consciousness after heavy blood loss, and they dragged him here, onto the vessel. All the wounds on his battered body were quite serious, deep, but now the lad hardly felt any pain, which seemed strange. So, most likely, the demonic palace employed some skilled healer to help him and heal the wounds. Moreover, the young man wanted to know what kind of people were around him, examining them. They were all physically well-built, like born warriors. Some of their faces were familiar. Apparently, all these guys had passed the first harsh test of physical abilities. However, it was clearly visible with what contempt they looked at the protagonist, which was quite expected after his pathetic performance. However, the protagonist barely came to his senses and realized what was happening around when one of the stern masters appeared above his head. He ordered the guys to go out onto the deck. After all, they had already arrived at the location of the next trial, called the Hellish Path. After that, the young man descended to the deck and asked that the test subjects follow him closely without falling behind. It turned out that the ship had stopped near the blood-red scorched lands, decorated with dried sand and parched soil cracked under the sun. The essence of the task was that the guys had to live in this cursed place for a certain time, undergoing the trial. Moreover, the examiner strictly demanded that they hand over all their clothes and weapons, change into what they were given, and take the swords prepared in advance with them. Further, the choice was already up to the test subjects. They could choose any cave they liked and enter it, setting up a dwelling. In the end, under the protagonist's watchful eye, the young men began to spread out over the territory, looking around different caves with curiosity. Some found quite comfortable caves, practically dry and spacious inside, and some simply quarreled over the best spots, trying to figure out who noticed them first and has the right to occupy them. Watching all these people, Bu Yun-sol realized one thing. None of them understood what was really happening. In the second test, these fools completely lost their sense of urgency and danger, dulling their vigilance. Moreover, the protagonist paid close attention to the fact that many of those who passed the exams were dressed luxuriously and richly. It seemed as if they were all heirs of some influential noble family's spoiled offspring. This was true. The first gathering point was created solely to weed out those who might die the fastest, unable to withstand the load. The examiner who approached the test subjects from behind was surprised that Bu Un-sol still hadn't chosen a cave, acting too slowly and indecisively. Although now was definitely not the time to wander around the area wasting precious time. In fact, the man approached the boy because he had been interested in him from the very beginning because of his behavior. But the master did not expect that this frail guy would pass the second bloody test, surviving the slaughter. Therefore, now, urging him on, the examiner wanted to find out, what choice would the mysterious young man make in the end? The boy pointed to the first cave that caught his eye, without thinking for long. However, some incomprehensible viscous substance was oozing from this cave, looking disgusting. Everyone immediately began to blame the boy, believing that he had chosen a truly godforsaken, disgusting place. Only one master understood the truth. This boy was a genuine genius in the flesh, able to see the hidden. At first glance, this cave appeared small, dirty, and unattractive, but that was only its narrow entrance, which scared off fools. Inside, however, there was so much free space that one could calmly practice martial arts without restriction of movement. And the narrow entrance also neutralized the possibility of an ambush. Enemies could not attack in a crowd. Of course, most people avoided this cave because of its repulsive appearance, but Bu Yun-sol had calculated everything in advance. As soon as everyone decided on the choice of cave, the examiners immediately handed out special clothing and the promised weapons. After that, the chief master gathered all the candidates to explain what mission they had next on the Hellish Path. As is known, on the Hellish Path there were 10 battle halls belonging to different sects. In each of them, the examinees could learn one of the martial arts of the demonic sections, mastering the secrets. Whether to study all or just one was decided by the examinees themselves, at their own discretion. They had no strict schedule. They could sleep or play, practice together or alone, do whatever they wanted. However, Bu Yun-sol found such lack of control and freedom of choice extremely strange. After all, the first 2 trials had been turned into a real bloody hell without mercy. Surely these people would not let them just train peacefully without incidents. The others suspected nothing and immediately began lively discussions about where it would be best to go first. Many decided to go to the Hall of the Sword of the Firestorm. After all, they had heard that this sect was the strongest of all the demonic sects. Of course, Bu Yun-sol immediately noticed. Most of the test subjects were going in one direction, like a flock of sheep. As is known, the head of the Hall of the Sword of the Firestorm was considered the strongest of the 10 demonic masters. A legend. Naturally, learning the best martial art would definitely be useful for the future. However, since the boy had not yet been trained in martial arts, there was no reason for him to engage in advanced techniques without the basics. Therefore, he decided to do something completely different and deliberately went in the opposite direction from all the other fools. Soon the young man found a small abandoned hut hidden from view. At first glance, Bu Yun-sol could not say for sure whether this miserable hut was a martial hall at all. It looked so neglected. This pavilion was related to the Nangya pavilion, a fallen sect barely recognized by the other arrogant masters, who despised it. However, it retained its place among the 10 only because it had produced many great warriors of the past who left a mark on history. He knew all this because his grandfather occasionally told his grandson stories and legends about martial arts while working. Therefore, the boy decided to stay here and begin studying martial arts precisely in this forgotten place. But suddenly, no sooner had he reached the pavilion than the ground beneath his feet shook threateningly. After this, the head of the master of the secret hall of the Nangya pavilion suddenly appeared before him, who quickly realized the young man had come here to become one of the 10 demonic masters. Of course, the young man was immensely surprised when the man's head suddenly emerged from the ground like a mole. After that, the protagonist hurriedly bowed respectfully, explaining. He had come here to learn the martial art of the pavilion, mastering the basics. However, the man carefully looked the young man up and down with an appraising gaze, then contemptuously sent him back on his way. Initially, the master, in principle, did not intend to teach anyone this year, especially did not want to take on such a frail young man like Bu-Eun's soul, who looked on the verge of death. However, the boy had heard, mastering the martial art of the Nangya Pavilion could grant the most powerful life force in the world, strengthening the body. The man was very surprised that Bu-Eun's soul was so well informed about their martial art, although the sect was forgotten. However, the problem was that even true geniuses had great difficulty mastering the true techniques of this hall. After all, the techniques originated in body reconstruction, breaking bones. And in Bu-Eun's soul's current pitiful state, he would have died before a day of torment. Therefore, disappearing back into the ground, the man suggested the boy get lost from here, not wasting time in vain. However, when he looked back at the boy one last time, he saw Bu-Eun's soul was already standing in a deep bow on his knees, not moving. After that, the young man explained to his teacher. He had to politely and properly greet his master as a diligent student, showing respect. In the end, after this persistence, the man was convinced. Bu-Eun's soul was crazy and stubborn enough not to listen to his moralizing and warnings. But still, he agreed to help, moved by the determination. What? However, he warned. He was helping him only because it was an order from the demonic palace, not out of kindness. Finally, the man fully emerged from underground and introduced himself. His name was Mr. Sa, and he was the master of the secret hall of the Nangya Pavilion, keeper of ancient knowledge. Bu-Eun's soul hurried to introduce himself to this stern man in return. However, the latter, without even hearing his name to the end, immediately sharply stopped the young man. The whole matter was that having joined the demonic cult, the young man simply became disciple number 1, and nothing more. After that, the old man suggested not wasting time on useless chatter, but instead to get closer to the matter without delay. Immediately after these words, the master attacked the youth with his energy just below the eyes. Because of this, the protagonist felt a powerful impulse passing through his entire body in waves. His gaze immediately dimmed, and impenetrable darkness appeared before his eyes. He saw absolutely nothing around, as if blinded. However, he heard the master's voice as if from nowhere, echoing. He asked the young man not to worry in vain, for he had temporarily sealed his vision using one of the secret techniques of the pavilion. After all, the main unarmed martial art Bongak required this. It was a mandatory procedure for mastering the Path of the Beast. The Path of the Beast is a martial art that brings all a person's senses to the absolute maximum, and also raises reflexes to the level of a wild animal, sharpening instincts. Unlike other advanced martial arts, the essence of the techniques of their sect heavily depended on the personal abilities and enlightenment of the practitioner. That is why even the basics of the Path of the Beast are studied as difficultly as any other advanced high-level technique. It is precisely because of this incredible difficulty that the number of those ready to accept these harsh trials has significantly decreased over time, almost disappearing. However, if the boy can successfully learn the Path of the Beast, it means he will gain the abilities of a wild predator, transforming. In principle, looking at the Radiant Master, the protagonist also saw the energy of a wolf, released from his body, enveloping him like an aura. But of course, Master Sa warned, most students do not live to reach such enlightenment, dying in agony. Therefore, bowing, he warned the young man. He had about an hour to get used to blindness. Then the mentor would return to check on him and assess his progress. In the end, the protagonist remained in complete darkness, unable to look around or see anything at all. They say that after losing sight, all other senses become extremely sharp. But so far, no such miracle had happened to him, to his disappointment. However, the master assured him, adaptation takes about an hour, no more. But to the hero, this hour seemed painfully long and endless. So he wished to get used to it as soon as possible, not wasting precious time. In the end, the young man began crawling on the ground, roughly imagining where he was and what was around him. All because he knew perfectly well. In this place there were countless martial arts masters fighting each other for the position of the demonic master. If he was destined to fall behind in training, he definitely would not survive among the competitors. However, suddenly the boy imagined someone appearing behind him, as if preparing to strike. Therefore, he hurriedly jumped aside and immediately, rolling over, fell to the ground, losing his balance. Only now did the protagonist realize an important truth. Having lost his sight, he must first pay attention to his sense of balance in order not to fall. Soon, after an hour had passed, the master came to check on the student. The mentor expected to see a boy wandering through the grass like a lost blind man, helplessly bumping into objects.
However, he saw the protagonist was in the midst of his training, moving confidently.
This was extremely unusual, because usually after losing sight, a person simply passively waits for the other senses to sharpen on their own. This very boy was actively moving, and it seemed even imagining an opponent trying to fight him, practicing movements. Perhaps for this reason he adapted significantly faster than all the other students had before. So, having made sure that student number 1 was already accustomed to the pitch darkness, the master decided to move on to the next stage of training. After which he drew the blade from behind his back to see how the boy would manage to dodge his swift strikes. Thus, in such a harsh regime, 3 long agonizing days passed without respite.
However, all the protagonist had endured so far were constant brutal beatings from his merciless master, who knew no mercy.
Honestly, even Mr. Say was surprised. After 3 days, the protagonist had no questions about the training methods. He simply continued to silently take the blows, got up, and took new ones without complaining. Therefore, unable to bear it, the master decided to find out. Why was the hero not curious about how to properly dodge or what techniques the mentor used? However, Bu-eun-sol hastened to recall the teacher's words. The essence of the pavilion's teaching lies in the personal abilities and enlightenment of the practitioner, not in ready-made instructions. From these wise words, the young man concluded. All the teacher's actions had a valid reason, and one just needed to trust the process. In principle, the master admitted with a satisfied smile. The protagonist was damn right in his guesses. After which he again lunged at him with the sheathed blade to continue beating the boy, testing his endurance. However, at this critical moment, the youth felt for the first time, as if he saw the sword's trajectory with his inner vision, like a bright line. Despite this insight, he could no longer dodge the strike, for the blade was too close to him, almost touching. Therefore, there was no choice. He drew his sword and for the first time managed to block the master's strike, reflecting the attack. Honestly, the mentor was deeply amazed that his student managed to block the silent sword technique after only 3 days of training. It was an incredible achievement. However, the striking force was still great, which caused the protagonist to be hastily thrown away like a splinter. Of course, he sighed in disappointment, realizing he had underestimated the sword technique, and blocking it was much harder than it seemed. The master said nothing, but instead immediately handed the hero a bamboo bottle from which he could quench his thirst. Taking it for ordinary water, the protagonist without hesitation immediately took a big sip. Only later did he feel something was wrong. The cup did not contain water at all. The boy's body began to overflow with energy, as if all the lost blood was instantly restored, returning his strength. It turned out to be water from a divine spring, which the teacher had kept since time immemorial. However, the mentor did not regret giving it away because he finally met someone worth the investment. After all, Bu-eun-sol was, in his eyes, the most valuable uncut diamond from the world of martial arts, hiding enormous potential. After Bu-eun-sol consumed the elixir, his training became even more diligent and intense. However, despite the master's seriousness in their training fights, the protagonist gradually managed to learn to avoid his strikes by catching their trajectories. So the most astonishing moment was when the boy deflected the master's attack coming from behind. At that point, the mentor stopped attacking altogether. When Bu-eun-sol looked around cautiously, he saw Master Sa laughing joyfully, choking with laughter. After all, he could not believe he had finally found the genius he had wanted to see his entire long life. Immediately after these words, the boy's vision finally began to return, clearing up. And the teacher happily asked the protagonist to forget about becoming one of the 10 demonic masters. Instead, let him become an official disciple of their main sect, dedicating his life to the pavilion. If the protagonist agreed, Master Sa would turn the boy into one of the strongest masters of the demonic path in just 10 years of hard training. The protagonist really considered this tempting offer, understanding, given the skill demonstrated by the mentor, he was not lying about what he could teach him over those years. However, the monster who killed his grandfather was undoubtedly much stronger than the protagonist is now. And in this situation, the martial art of the pavilion will still not be enough to defeat the enemy. Therefore, the young man tried to calmly explain to the mentor he needed to become one of the 10 demonic masters, no matter what. Honestly, the man was even surprised by the young man's determination, but warned it was impossible to learn all the martial arts of the 10 sections. Even the supreme grandmaster like the heavenly demon could not accomplish this, despite all his power. After all, each martial art requires a special body and energy flow, specific training. No matter how talented a person is, at most he can learn 2 or 3 styles by focusing his attention. Learning one martial art is the shortest path to becoming the best on the demonic path, proven by centuries. But despite this warning, the protagonist, apologizing, made it clear to the man he would not be able to become his permanent student, no matter how much he wanted to. Honestly, the master was slightly upset, although he tried not to show it, hiding his emotions. After that, he calmly explained to the boy, In that case, he could now choose another martial art for further training. Of course, the boy explained fearfully. He had only just begun learning the basic techniques of the pavilion. How could he leave already? However, the master explained, the true art of the main sect is not passed down through texts or oral tales recorded in words. After that, he hastily attacked, waiting until the protagonist blocked his attack, thus proving he had already fully learned the beast's path, grasping its essence. Only now, looking at the man with gratitude, the protagonist realized all his attacks while the young man was blind were actually forms of the beast path technique, transmitted through strikes. The young man immediately bowed respectfully, thanking the master for his wise teaching and patience. However, the master reminded him, he taught the youth only by order of the demonic palace, nothing more. The protagonist solemnly promised he would never forget the noble gesture of the master when he handed him the priceless spiritual medicine, saving him from death. However, even about this, the master asked him to forget. Still, the world of martial arts is arranged so that whether it is nobility or offense, the easiest way is to repay with blood and revenge. Of course, he did not argue with the wise Lord Bu-Un Sol. Instead, bowing to his mentor and thanking him sincerely for everything, he said goodbye and walked away. The mentor himself watched him leave for a long time, wondering, where did such a precious gem appear in their lands? From just one look at this young man and his incredible talent, one could say, great changes awaited the demonic palace in the future. At the same time, the protagonist noticed a strangeness. Due to mastering the beast path, he felt so much around him that he was exhausted, even doing nothing. At this rate, he would not even be able to rest and recover properly. So the young man needed to learn to control the beast path, suppressing it. He wanted to suppress his heightened senses as much as possible during ordinary times, so as not to constantly focus on them. The young man tried to imagine something resembling a crane that blocks the flow of water by shutting it off. In the end, he managed to temporarily get rid of the annoying feelings. They remained somewhere far in the background, no longer disturbing his peaceful life. Therefore, taking the map in his hands, the protagonist decided to understand what would be his next step on this path. Obviously, the demonic palace would never allow them to train forever, sooner or later arranging a trial. That means he might not have much time left before changes, so there was no choice. The boy had to make a decision about which pavilion to go to next in order to make the most of his time. Then the boy hastily recalled the story about the great master of incomparable martial arts who challenged the heavenly demon 700 years ago. He was the legendary Sword Emperor. The protagonist went to the strongest of the 10 demonic sects that he had founded in his time. This luxurious redwood training hall bore the majestic name Hua Wu. Indeed, when the protagonist approached it, it was immediately obvious at first glance. This place resembled a royal palace compared to the miserable hall of the Nangya Pavilion. When the young man knocked, the door was quickly opened by a young man to understand why the visitor had come to them at such a late hour. However, as soon as the mentor glanced at the uniform the young disciple was wearing, everything became perfectly clear. The boy had come here not without reason. Bowing respectfully, the hero humbly explained the true purpose of his visit. He longed to master the martial art under the guidance of the master. The mentor, without delaying for a moment, led the young student through the open gates. Walking through the corridors of the training pavilion, the master hurriedly began to explain. The art of their school was considered the strongest among all 10 martial schools, and therefore required incredibly long months of persistent mastery. Those worthy students who arrived in the halls before the hero had already successfully completed training in the beginner's hall, and moved on to the intermediate level of skill. Therefore, the mentor asked with sincere bewilderment, why did the young man come here only half a month after the start of training? The protagonist respectfully hastened to explain. First of all, he went to study martial arts in the Nyangya Pavilion in order to master the legendary beast path. Naturally, the master was deeply shocked by what he heard. Although the mentor knew that this boy possessed an extraordinary gift, he did not expect that anyone could master the beast path in just a mere 2 weeks. So he assumed. The teacher from the pavilion simply sent the young man away so as not to waste precious time on his training. Such an outcome seemed much more plausible and expected. Soon the mentor and the student reached the training ground. The young man politely introduced himself as Jingak. He was responsible for the beginner's hall. Bu-Un Sol could address him with the title of instructor. However, before starting the lessons, the mentor decided to clarify with the hero. Was he really sure about his desire to study their sword techniques? After all, it would be much easier and faster for the young man if he went to some other, less demanding training hall. Although the boy was sincerely grateful to the instructor for such care and concern, he firmly explained he wished to master precisely the techniques of the renowned sword sect, and no others. In that case, Jingak had no reason left to restrain the student's enthusiasm. Therefore, the instructor decisively stepped onto the wooden floorboard, causing a deafening explosion throughout the training area. Immediately after that, an ancient scroll smoothly descended from the upper floor. It contained the basic forms and practical principles of the legendary 13 Huawu forms, which Bu Un-sol was to study in order to begin full training. However, to great regret, no matter how much the young man stared at these intricate scrolls, he could not understand what was required of him and how to begin the training. Of course, Jin-gak could not believe something so incredible. Could it be that the boy does not know how to read combat diagrams? The mentor was thrown into complete shock when he finally became convinced. The student really did not possess this essential skill. Bu Un-sol had to awkwardly, and with obvious embarrassment, explain. Before joining the demonic cult, he had never studied the art of fencing, and therefore such diagrams remained a dark forest to him. Such information plunged Jin-gak into unprecedented amazement. It was strange because in the lists of students he was listed as a full-fledged novice. Moreover, his movements during the second trial did not resemble any of the formal sword styles known in the Celestial Empire. And yet what remained truly astonishing was that the boy could not even read the simplest sword diagrams. However, if you look at this unfortunate situation from another perspective, considering the youth's lightning-fast reflexes and his amazing attention to the smallest details, which he demonstrated during the second trial, he definitely had brilliant hopes for success. Especially if you take into account the boy's prudence in choosing a cave to live in the mountains. So if this gifted student receives proper training from an experienced mentor, it was even hard to imagine what an incredible martial arts monster he could be raised into. In the end, Jin-gak was not at all upset by the news received. Although the boy did not know how to read intricate diagrams with images of poses, he recognized symbols and hieroglyphs excellently. On the ancient poster, there was an instruction written in calligraphic handwriting, how to master the body and flow without the slightest effort, like a mountain stream. After careful reading, Jin-gak immediately hurried to explain the essence of the first part. To free the body meant complete relaxation of the muscles and smooth, natural movement when using sword techniques. In particular, the student should relax the abdominal muscles and thigh muscles so that chi energy freely circulates through the body. As a result, the youth relaxed as much as he could at that moment. Looking at this rather pitiful sight, Jin-gak suddenly realized what an incredible dissonance is caused by the need to teach someone such elementary basics. The mentor asked the boy to straighten up and patiently explained that when he tenses his body, he must block the flow of chi at certain points, while calming and relaxing the mind, discarding all extraneous thoughts and worries. After that, Jin-gak demonstrated to him the correct fighting stance, which belonged to the next, more complex part of the diagram. However, the boy took the correct position almost instantly and caught every movement literally on the fly, like a born genius of martial arts. As a result, the position of his body after the first repetition became simply flawless, requiring no additional adjustments. After that, they continued their training with doubled zeal. Very soon, the young man was already dancing with his blade like an experienced master, who had devoted many years of his life to fencing. Watching this mesmerizing spectacle, Jin-gak realized with amazement. The boy was literally a born fencer, whom the gods of martial arts had gifted with an exceptional talent. Now that they had successfully completed the basic training, the instructor asked the boy to imagine an opponent in front of him and perform all 13 forms of Huawu from beginning to end. This was a mandatory condition for the successful completion of the beginner's hall and the transition to the next level of mastery. Jin-gak had to feel the true purpose and intention in the technique of the young student. Of course, he was anxious before this decisive trial. However, the hero firmly decided to prove himself as befits a true warrior, since the test caught him faster than he had originally expected. In the end, the protagonist focusedly imagined before himself a certain imaginary enemy whom he absolutely had to defeat in an honest duel. As soon as this faceless opponent materialized before his mental vision, the boy immediately gripped the hilt of his trusty sword tightly. He swiftly used the 13th form. The winds returned to its original source, cutting the enemy in half with a single merciless strike. After that, the young warrior methodically attacked the enemy from the very first to the last 13th form, demonstrating all the mastery of his art. However, to be honest, watching this astonishing act, Jin-gak could not believe his own eyes. Bu Un-sol demonstrated the usual 13 forms of Huawu in a completely different way than all previous students. As is known to anyone who has mastered this art, the third position, the melting cloud, should be soft and flowing, like a heavenly cloud floating high above. However, the version the young man demonstrated was unimaginably sharp and aggressive, like a lightning strike on a stormy night. So Jin-gak immediately guessed. The boy deliberately changed the original form to his unique style. But usually no one below the honorable level of Grandmaster would dare to commit such sacrilege against the classical technique. Moreover, this adapted form carried a colossal will to kill and was aimed at a specific person whom the boy passionately sought to avenge for the death of his close one. It was truly an incredible, breathtaking spectacle. The Hua Wu technique, known since ancient times for its righteousness and nobility even among demonic cults, in such an exquisite form turned into something truly demonic and merciless. At that very moment, the young swordsman panicked, noticing with horror the trajectory of his blade began to treacherously change due to the incorrect position of the fingertips on the hilt. He realized, most likely the cause was the harmful influence of the beast's path, which he had mastered in the Ananke Pavilion. Still, the higher he rose through the forms of Hua Wu, the more distinctly the sinister imprint of this beast technique appeared in his movements. But no matter how much the hero wished, in this way he would never fully master the original form. And even if by some miracle he could complete all 13 forms, they would no longer be the sacred forms of Hua Wu, but a completely new, hitherto unseen fighting style. Therefore, the protagonist tried with all his remaining strength to flawlessly perform the original form and worthily continue this decisive trial. But at this fateful moment, some impenetrable veil of mental darkness suddenly attacked the hero. His faceless imaginary enemy instantly turned into that very vile murderer of his beloved grandfather. So in the end, not realizing that these were merely cunning games of the mind and illusions, Bu-un's soul completely lost his mind from an all-consuming thirst for revenge. He applied 13 forms at his discretion with particular cruelty and fury. The instructor, observing this bloody act from the side, clearly understood. He had never encountered such a fast and fierce fighter in his long life. However, the boy's imaginary enemy also did not give him a single minute of respite, relentlessly attacking. So until the imaginary enemy finally killed him, Bu-un's soul was obliged to use all the remaining sword forms without exception. However, at this tragic moment, the protagonist repeated the terrible fate of his late grandfather. He noticed with horror the bloody stains spreading over his trembling hands. In the end, both hands of the fencer were mercilessly cut off by the imaginary opponent. When the young man finally came to his senses, breaking free from the nightmare visions, he realized. Cold sweat continued to roll down his pale forehead. Watching this sad spectacle, the most logical conclusion for Jingak was that Bu-un's soul had been defeated in his imaginary fight against the ghost of the past. But still, despite this unfortunate outcome, the young student successfully passed the trial. The whole point was that in the beginner's hall, the instructors only evaluated the student's grip and whether he was capable of applying the 13 forms of Hua Wu in a real fight. And all the instructor could say with a clear conscience was that Bu-un's soul demonstrated all these requirements perfectly, exceeding all expectations. Handing the young man the blade that had slipped from his weakened fingers, Jingak sincerely praised him for the flawless execution of all 13 forms and solemnly suggested moving to the intermediate hall for further improvement. The hero, with genuine admiration and gratitude, looked at instructor Jingak, fully understanding how incredibly difficult it was for him to teach someone with absolutely zero knowledge of the sword. And yet the mentor took on this thankless task, patiently going through each stage of comprehension with the student. Therefore, bowing deeply as a sign of profound respect, the hero sincerely thanked the master for everything he had done for him. But Jingak only asked that the boy continue to train as diligently as he had all these days. However, the instructor still noted with concern. The young man's sword carried a clear, unhidden intent to kill, so Bu-un's soul absolutely needed to be cautious, so as not to let this all-consuming desire finally engulf him and turn him into darkness. After these parting words, they finally said goodbye as mentor and student. And Jingak once again confirmed. Bu-un's soul had truly mastered the legendary beast's path in just a mere 2 weeks. Moreover, due to his unique, truly monstrous learning speed, the young man managed to graduate from the beginner's hall earlier than expected. At first, Jingak seriously doubted whether the inexperienced boy could reach the intermediate hall within the allotted time. But now the mentor was firmly convinced. Even the strict instructor of the intermediate hall would surely notice Bu-un's soul's outstanding potential. However, when the boy himself appeared in the training room of the intermediate hall, the local instructor, unaware of who he was, rudely ordered him to get out and not disturb the classes. Obviously, the stern man simply assumed that Bu-un's soul had just finished the beginner's hall. And since the boy had taken more than 20 days for that, he was simply wasting precious time trying to complete the intermediate hall. However, respectfully bowing, Bu-un's soul tried to politely explain the reason for being late to training. He spent the first 2 weeks in the Nyangya Pavilion Hall. The man could not believe it. Could this boy have finished the Nyangya Hall and the beginner's hall so quickly? So at first, the instructor thought, surely the young man simply failed to master the beast's path, so he fled from there in shame, and is now trying to find consolation here. But since the boy did complete the beginner's hall by all the rules, the stern instructor condescended to allow him to join the other students. although the man seriously doubted that the young man would manage to catch up on all the missed material and not fall behind the group. The mentor explained, "The technique of the Hua-Wu sword sect is a martial art consisting of swift, lightning-fast movements. Therefore, if a person does not sufficiently master the sword and control of their body, they might accidentally injure even themselves in the heat of battle. For this reason, the techniques of their sect are extremely difficult to use in real combat. Therefore, the man generously promised not to look at the victories or defeats of the students in duels, but only to consider how well they wield the sword and apply the learned forms." After that, the instructor authoritatively called one of the students forward and asked him to choose a worthy opponent for a training duel. Rising with a sly smile on his lips, the chosen student decided to clarify, "Are there any restrictions on choosing an opponent for the duel?" And upon learning from the mentor that there were no restrictions, the confident young man immediately pointed at Bu Yun-sol, mercilessly making him his opponent. Of course, the instructor doubted the correctness of such a choice. After all, this boy had just joined them and was hardly ready for a full-fledged duel. However, the student reminded the mentor, he himself allowed choosing any enemy. But these bold words only further infuriated the instructor. He did not understand. What skill was the student going to demonstrate if he chose as his opponent someone who had just arrived from the beginner's hall? However, rising from his seat, Bu Yun-sol explained, he was ready to accept the challenge of this arrogant student. After all, in the beginner's hall, he was taught to wield the sword by instructor Jin Gak. So the young man assumed he could catch up on the missed material faster if he crossed blades with another student in a real duel. However, the mentor of the intermediate hall believed that the boy was only trying to defend his pride. After all, with the skills of just the beginner's hall, he could never win. But since the protagonist had already accepted the challenge, there was no point in arguing. The instructor, pointing to the swords, reminded that the main virtue of a martial arts master is the ability to soberly assess one's own skills. So he hoped that Bu Yun-sol's abilities would justify his presence in this hall. At the same time, the arrogant student was glad to have the opportunity to demonstrate his strength by beating the hero. Because there were many talented kids in the pavilion, he did not particularly stand out among them. But Bu Yun-sol, in his opinion, was a pathetic weakling. So if he managed to properly defeat him in this fight, it would only strengthen the duelist's position among the other students. Before the duel began, the opponent honestly admitted to Bu Yun-sol that he admired the young fighter's bravery. But still, the boy was convinced that with only pride and fighting spirit, one could not survive in this world. After these words, at the instructor's signal, he immediately moved into battle with some inhuman rage. However, despite the swift strike, Bu Yun-sol easily managed to dodge, using the instinct of a beast. Immediately after that, the hero continued to fend off the opponent's attacks, although it caused some inconvenience. The attacker himself was happy. He saw how Bu Yun-sol was struggling, so he was convinced that one really was a novice. The duelist was ready to swear that he could handle this clumsy fool. He even decided to demonstrate the true mastery of the techniques of the Hua-Wu sect. After which, the student used the attack of the first form from the 13 forms of the sect. However, the hero managed to skillfully dodge every strike and not a single hair fell from his head. The instructor watching the fight realized the middle hall student had mastered the sword at a rather mediocre level. But the novice dodged not thanks to speed. His movements were close to predicting the future. Perhaps the boy really managed to learn the beast's path. However, although according to the mentors, this was the basic martial art of the pavilion, in reality, it was the most difficult martial art, accessible only to great masters. No matter how gifted the boy was, no one managed to master it in just 2 weeks. Therefore, the instructor interrupted the hero with a loud kick to the floor. He warned he would not be able to assess the youth's abilities if he only dodged. The duel was aimed at testing swordsmanship, instincts, and reflexes. Therefore, Bu Yun-sol had to take the fight more seriously. In the end, having no other choice, the protagonist had to stop and attack the opponent with a sword form. Of course, all the spectators immediately gaped in surprise. However, they immediately realized these were not standard sect forms, but something completely different. Only one fool duelist had not yet recognized this, being confident that he could easily dodge the strike with his eyes closed. Only later did he realize the young man possessed the same techniques they had been studying all this time. So the boy was deliberately hiding his skills to mock him in front of everyone? Or maybe he wanted to get the instructor's attention and advance to the next hall. Obviously, the guy panicked. He saw attentive gazes fixed on him. He understood. If he lost to Bu Yun-sol, he would be disgraced in front of everyone. Therefore, he decided he would be the first to move to the advanced hall. For this, he used the Asura sword technique, which interrupts blood. Watching this, the instructor did not even intervene. After all, he never specified that only Hua-Wu techniques could be used in the duel. However, the man was amazed when he realized Bu-eun's soul did not lose his balance even in such a situation. The mentor began to doubt more and more. Could the hero really have learned the beast's path in 2 weeks? At the same time, the attacker was furious, watching how good the opponent was at dodging attacks, but he swore to kill him. After that, the duelist attacked using the bloody wind technique, which destroys the very moon. However, no one even had time to twitch before the deadly energy was exhausted in an instant. Using the 13th form technique, the extreme martial art without a beginning, Bu-eun's soul managed to stop the enemy. In the end, the hero struck the opponent in the solar plexus with the tip of his sword, and he fell to the ground, losing consciousness. All the others froze, their mouths agape in astonishment. However, looking at the body lying in its own blood, they realized Bu-eun's soul seemed to have killed his enemy. The young man himself, as if nothing had happened, returned to the stand from which he had taken the sword and put it back in place. The instructor confirmed. The student was dead. It seemed the strike had hit a vital point. Obviously, the man immediately suspected. Perhaps Bu-eun's soul had previously been a student of the Nangyan Pavilion. He decided to find out. Had the boy really learned the beast's path in half a month? However, the boy explained he was only taught the basics. The instructor became even angrier, thinking that the boy had been very well taught to lie in the pavilion. After that, he ordered the hero to be silent. He did not want to hear his excuses. Instead, he could have been cleaning up the body. The others could not believe it. Bu-eun's soul would not even be punished for killing a person during a regular sparring match. However, the instructor was furious with these frightened, pathetic students. Therefore, he reminded them, this place was not a real training hall just by name. They were in hell, and when someone used a deadly technique, they had to be ready to die from a counterattack. After that, the test continued for the other students. Very soon, only a handful of the defeated remained, who failed to pass this test. So the instructor drove them away and ordered them to go find another hall that would be willing to accept them. Of course, they begged the mentor to give them another chance to prove their strength. However, this was impossible. Still, they could enter the beginner's hall thanks to their good physical abilities. But to master the technique of the Hwawu sword, one must be a combat genius who surpasses the limits of their own body through incredible effort. The surviving students simply could not cope with this because they were not capable of it. After that, the instructor sternly drove these guys away out of sight. In the end, when everyone dispersed, only one single hero remained in the hall, not knowing where to go. When the instructor approached him, the boy fearfully thought that he was also going to be driven away. Therefore, the mentor had to explain. Since the youth won the duel and passed the test, he could calmly advance to the advanced hall. However, Bu-eun's soul instead preferred to stay in the intermediate hall. After all, he had only learned the basics of the 13 forms so far, and had not yet mastered anything in the intermediate hall. Honestly, the instructor was amazed by the youth, who not only studied the beast's path but also reflected the chaotic style of the Asura sect, and was still dissatisfied with his level. But it was precisely because of his persistence that the mentor decided to teach the boy. He decided to tell him the technique of the backrow sword, which follows the 13 forms of Hwawu. However, he warned, he despises everyone who uses various tricks just to make an impression. If he sees even the slightest trace that the boy studied fencing outside of the Hwawu techniques, he will immediately be beheaded. However, his stern facial expression was illuminated by complete incomprehension just 4 days later. He trained the hero for 4 days and studied him from all sides. However, the youth's foundation in fencing was practically zero, so it was hard to believe. This boy had barely begun to learn swordsmanship despite all his skill. Moreover, his determination was simply incredible. He gave his all in every movement, as if he would die if he failed. So now the man perfectly understood how the hero managed to master the beast's path in just half a month. Finally, the youth managed to learn and hone the strikes of the backrow sword technique, the extreme lightning strikes. But at that moment, just as Bu-eun's soul was in the midst of training, the instructor ordered him to stop. As soon as the youth froze, the mentor explained. The boy had already grasped the entire sword technique, so no more training was needed. After that, he also explained, this sword technique is just a style that requires different body turns for quick switching between speed forms. Moreover, all its forms are designed for such sword movements around the body that it is literally inapplicable in real combat. And yet the instructor noted, Bu-eun's soul tries to use absolutely every form in battle, as if he wants to kill someone. However, despite these words, the mentor explained, this was not the main goal of the sword style. As it turned out, most demonic martial arts require a thirst for killing. However, the Hwawu sect rejected this mindset, which exists only to kill opponents to achieve greater heights. But the thirst for killing was in the boy's head. If he does not erase it, he will create a sword style that will harm himself. And these words were exactly the same as those of instructor Jingak, so Bu-eun's soul was not even surprised. The man himself explained, in the past, and even now, he lived with a similar feeling of thirst for killing. Without a doubt, He got rid of everyone who stood in his way. Because of this, his status, honor, and even mastery of martial arts fell to a lower level. Still, the thirst for killing, as it may seem, leads a person to heights, but in reality, it is only an obstacle blocking the way up. From this moment, Bu-eun-sol needed to get rid of this feeling. After all, the past of all martial arts masters is stained with pity and failures. Therefore, all members of the martial arts world did not like to talk about their past, just like Bu-eun-sol's grandfather. However, after this enlightenment, the hero himself became curious. Why was the instructor so kind to him, like a caring mentor? It turned out that the man simply saw a resemblance to the boy, as he himself had experienced something similar in the past, going through the same torments and doubts. After that, the instructor finally decided to find out the young man's name and addressed him by it. He also realized, when Jin-gak told him about the survivor of the second trial, he was talking precisely about Bu-eun-sol. However, the protagonist had a serious problem, a lack of foundation in martial arts. His future opponents were promising young men who had been training in martial arts since early childhood, absorbing techniques literally with their mother's milk. As soon as the hero begins to study the more serious aspects of the Hua Wu sword in the advanced hall, the difference in their skills will only increase, like a chasm between heaven and earth. And to eliminate this gap, Bu-eun-sol had to rapidly learn the highest martial arts and build a solid foundation for mastering techniques. Therefore, now, in order to shorten this gap, the instructor decided to pass on to the boy the Jongro Musen technique, which he personally created, investing years of his own experience into it. However, the mentor warned. While learning it, he himself made a fatal mistake, after which all the nerves in his fingers were irreversibly dulled. This technique is so dangerous that Bu-eun-sol could even completely lose control over his hands. In that case, instead of advancing to the next hall, the hero risked becoming a pathetic armless cripple, unable even to hold a sword. Therefore, the instructor wanted to know, was the boy willing to accept this risk, fully aware of all the danger? However, the answer was obvious. For his own revenge, the hero was ready to give even his own soul, not to mention his hands. Thus, a whole month passed since the boy began studying the Jongro Musen technique, working tirelessly day and night. Before leaving the intermediate hall, the instructor said that the young man managed quickly, but it still took more time than he initially expected. Having studied the basic techniques in the beginner's hall and more complex ones in the intermediate, Bu-eun-sol finally managed to advance further on the warrior's path. Only he was late again, but this time to the advanced hall, where the others had arrived much earlier. Looking around the room, Bu-eun-sol noticed. Everything felt very different here, as if even the air in this place was different, saturated with power and danger. Moreover, from the students he now felt a completely different energy, not like in the intermediate hall, more mature and threatening. And the previous contempt in their looks was gone, which was not surprising, considering the killing of the guy who dared to show off in front of the hero and paid for it with his life. However, Bu-eun-sol still found it strange that caring for corpses caused disgust in people, while killing another person brought honor and respect in this mad world. The instructor recognized the boy who came in as the very Bu-eun-sol, about whom he had heard a lot, and warned that the lesson had not yet started. Therefore, he suggested the hero sit down and join the other students. And since they had a new student, the old man decided to explain once again the Hua Wu sword song and the 7 sacred teachings to refresh their knowledge. All teachings. This is the power flowing through the whole body. Stand straight and keep balance unshakable. Chest broad, back straight, and don't overdo it on the first strike, and so on. However, thanks to the fact that the young man studied a more complex technique in the intermediate hall, he was able to understand all these teachings in the advanced hall much faster than the others. As a result, the lesson ended very quickly. Before the old man dismissed the students to their homes, he asked Bu-eun-sol to stay for a moment for a special conversation. After that, the mentor took the young man outside to walk in silence. There the old man began to ponder an ancient phrase, "No sword alone can defeat a sword." This phrase meant reaching a level when a person can defeat an armed opponent even without a blade in hand. Simply put, whether a warrior is with a sword or without it, his strength should not be limited by the weapon. And he decided to demonstrate it when he turned a fragment of an ordinary branch into a real deadly blade aimed at the boy's head. After that, the mentor suggested the boy imagine that he was suddenly attacked right now, and his hands were empty, but he needed to use fencing skills to survive. The old man explained to the pensive hero. While he was in the middle hall, the disciples here had already mastered the first sword technique Hua Wu, the dazzling depth, and now they have even moved on to the stage of philosophical reflections on the essence of the sword. However, if the boy does not understand what the man just asked him, he will immediately leave the hall without the right to return. So he needed to answer very carefully and thoughtfully. In the end, the hero's answer was very simple. If he did not have a sword, he had to use his opponent's blade. After that, the young man tried to snatch the old man's weapon with a swift throw. However, he had not yet moved when the old man was already behind him, scolding the young man for his hasty and thoughtless action. Panicked, the hero continued to attack from all sides. However, it was impossible to even predict the old man's movements. It seemed the man existed simultaneously at all points in space, so it was extremely difficult to understand where he would be in the next moment. And Bu Yun-sol could not even hope to keep up with this nimble old man. However, the fact that he could not even follow the mentor's movements caused him a mixture of surprise and admiration. But if he doesn't demonstrate anything to him now, the old man will not allow him to stay in the advanced hall. Therefore, the hero decided to push his beastly feelings to the absolute limit and read the mentor's movement directions, all for the sake of at least touching the weapon he held in his hands with his fingertips. In the end, he succeeded. However, the boy was hastily thrown back by the power of the colliding energies. He already thought he had failed at the most crucial moment, but before the young man could get up, the old man helped him stand. Moreover, the mentor laughed, rejoicing that Bu Yun-sol had passed his test. Of course, the boy was quite surprised that he managed to complete the task without landing a single blow on the opponent. The smiling old man explained to the young man, starting tomorrow he can begin studying the new technique, and invited him to the training ground. However, the hero had to arrive before dawn to be earlier than all the other students and receive special training. The protagonist did not ask any unnecessary questions, immediately bowed respectfully, and said goodbye to the old man, thanking him for the trust placed. Immediately after the boy left, the man looked at the stick, which was breaking and crumbling in his hands after a brief fight with the hero. At that moment, looking at the young man's face, he realized even the wolf cub still carried the danger of an adult enraged wolf within him. Therefore, the old man eagerly awaited what the boy would demonstrate to him next. The hero himself was glad. Today's lessons were over, and he could rest or cultivate energy, or maybe even start exploring the hellish path. Considering what happened to him in the middle hall, he could not be sure that suddenly somewhere a fight to the death would not break out. But unexpectedly in the distance, the young man felt someone's footsteps approaching with threatening intent. Using his beast sense, he realized 5 people had come for his soul. When the hero turned around, he saw his classmates who thought that Bu Un-sol had become a bit arrogant since the middle hall, and they wanted to rid him of this bad habit in a very cruel way. And considering that the guy was the first to kill another student, the group of 5, known as the strongest swords, had to teach him a good lesson. However, the hero perfectly understood. The fact that there were not 5 of them was a deception, and he felt the presence of a 6th hiding in the shadows. But despite this, the young man immediately took a fighting stance, preparing for a battle to the death. Obviously, seeing the fighting stance, the Great 5 became angry, thinking that this guy underestimated their strength and skill. The irritated leader drew his blade intending to attack. But in the next moment, he received a powerful blow to the neck, causing him to cough up blood and collapse to the ground, losing consciousness. The person who struck him was a handsome but no less terrifying warrior named So Jin-ha. Looking at Bu Un-sol, he made it clear to the boy. They had something to discuss in private. 4 of the 5 did not understand what So Jin-ha was doing here, and why he attacked their comrade without warning. However, the warrior coldly ordered them to peacefully get out of his way, for they did not interest him. Just mere kids, unworthy of attention. And of course, those who took the defeated leader fled away in fear. But they swore they would deal with Bu Un-sol another time, when So Jin-ha was not around. After that, the guy, as if nothing had happened, pointed the blade at the hero and made it clear. Finally, a real conversation could begin. The memories shifted to the previous day, to the old man's lesson. The mentor explained, although the students studied the first Hua-Wu sword technique, the dazzling depth, one could only claim to have fully learned it when they created their own unique sword form. So he decided to check what they had created. First of all, the old man called Bu Un-sol to the stage, asking him to perform the first technique in front of everyone. Once on stage, the guy sighed heavily under the intense gazes of the crowd, feeling the pressure of dozens of eyes. Immediately after, the youth drew all 13 strikes one by one with impeccable precision. The old man, analyzing the movements, saw. The boy took the most serious and complex sword technique and turned it into something created solely for killing, devoid of any beauty. He calmly asked the hero to return to his place and called the next student from the hall. Next in line was a warrior named So Jin-ha. However, when he stepped onto the stage, Bu Yun-sol immediately noticed a suspicious movement of his sword, full of hidden meaning. At the moment of demonstrating his technique, he definitely executed a counterattack against the one Bu Un-sol showed in the arena, as if warning him about something important. However, right now the hero had no idea what So Jin-ha was talking to him about, and he only got furious at the boy's misunderstanding, thinking that the hero was acting like some kind of fool unwilling to see the obvious. Of course, the warrior perfectly understood. Not everyone gathered within the school walls to become one of the demonic masters, And indeed, if you think about it, coming here was an incredible opportunity to learn the arts, and to participate you literally needed nothing but desire. In that case, this opportunity also becomes a cunning trap for unwanted people infiltrating the ranks of the students. And obviously, Bu Yun's soul suspected. So Jinha's fears were connected to the fact that among the school's students there were spies sent from outside. The warrior himself, analyzing Bu Yun's soul's facial expression and voice, realized the boy was truly surprised, which meant he was not lying to his face. Therefore, he sighed in disappointment, realizing that the spy was not the hero after all. And so Jinha was just about to have plenty of fun with the spy, extracting all his secrets. After that, the turned-around warrior calmly left, but asked that from now on the hero not stand out too much in the training hall and behave well. Then everything would be fine with him. But if the guy continued to get on his nerves, then So Jinha would simply get rid of him without any unnecessary ceremonies. With these words he left, leaving the hero in deep thought. Having learned that spies were operating in this place, the boy worried for a long time, realizing how much he did not know about what was happening around. He believed that he was suspected because he put all his efforts into studying the arts of the Niange Pavilion and the Huawu sect simultaneously. However, for now, the young man decided not to worry. Whether it was a spy or some kind of demon, it was just an opponent that Bu Yun's soul would sooner or later have to face in battle. Finally, another school day came to an end. So the old man finished the lessons with a smile, looking around the classroom and imagining how tired the students were after this hard day of training. However, he reminded them, even masters who had survived many real battles always made time to study the principles of advanced martial arts. Because in this matter, knowledge does not mean ability, and the ability to do something is equated with true knowledge. The interpretation of principles by the old man, which he had been presenting to the students until now, could become a good support for the path of each candidate in the world of martial arts. Therefore, he wished success to all who studied under him in all upcoming battles and trials. At that moment, everyone heard the sound of a gong, which spread throughout the area, announcing an important event. This meant that the time had come to an end. Therefore, the old man ordered the students to prepare to go to the mountain in the center of the island, where something important awaited them. When everyone had already arrived there, a golden dagger with a bloody eye was already waiting for them. Looking at each student with special attention and scrutiny, he solemnly announced, from this moment the third trial would begin. Of course, all the kids began to whisper excitedly when they heard about the third trial. After all, they believed it should be the second trial, not the third. However, Bu Yun's soul clearly remembered that merciless fight to the death that he went through. And it was the second trial. But it seems the others did not know about it, and no one intended to explain anything to them. The master explained, soon all the caves will be sealed with magical seals until 10 candidates are chosen. Until that moment, no one will be able to return to these caves. Therefore, he suggested to the anxious students to prepare in advance and gather everything necessary for survival. And obviously, one person in the crowd was extremely interested to know by what principle these very candidates would be chosen. As soon as Jingak opened his mouth to explain something, Haek Ren-un immediately shamed all these disgraced ones. He reminded them they were on the demonic path, and obviously, their trial was to kill each other until only the strongest remained. The Golden Dagger wanted them to kill until only the last 10 survivors remained. The task was not too difficult, so it was quite manageable for any sufficiently strong warrior. Of course, the mentor suggested the frightened ones hide in the shadows and avoid open fights like cowardly rats. However, he understood perfectly well. This would not help them much. Over time, the zone where one could stay will relentlessly shrink, and those who remain in the forbidden zone will quickly die. For this, he presented them with ghosts, a top-secret elite squad of fighters, who will be responsible for the ruthless elimination of those who fail the exam. And honestly, their deadly aura was so great and sinister that the boy felt its pressure, even though they stood in the very depths of the crowd. Even so, Jinha understood. These were true masters with incredible skills honed over years. However, unexpectedly, one of the students decided to clarify with the Golden Dagger. Could they attack the ghosts in response? This daring question greatly pleased the old man. He made it clear. Those who want to be among the top 10 must be ready to fight absolutely any opponent, no matter how strong they are. Of course, they could engage in combat with the ghosts. They could even kill them if the students had enough strength and skill for it. The mentor also delighted the listeners by saying that if anyone managed to kill even one of the ghosts, they would immediately take a place among the 10 chosen candidates, bypassing all other trials. Obviously, this meant only one thing. Killing a single ghost was much harder than exterminating a whole bunch of weak students around. Haek Ren-un himself warned the kids. They could be loners or could group into gangs, setting ambushes and traps. They did not care, as long as they killed. The students had to use absolutely any methods for this. Only then could they become among the chosen. Immediately after this, the trial began, and the examinees scattered in different directions like frightened animals, moving as fast as possible away from danger. The hero perfectly understood. Over the past time, he had attracted too much attention from other students, so it would be wiser for him to hide out of sight for a while. If he did not choose the right strategy, he could fall into a trap, just like when 5 students attacked him at once. At first, the protagonist decided to hide in a safe place, and he definitely knew one suitable spot. It was a remote Nangya pavilion where he trained together with Master Sa, away from prying eyes. However, running across the ground, the young man realized the soil beneath his feet felt completely different, as if alive. After that, he touched the ground with his palm to check what was wrong with it. But at that moment, the hero's animal instinct sensed 3 fighters were rapidly approaching him. The first to jump out of the bushes was a young guy who desperately asked Bu-eun's soul for help. After all, freaks had latched onto him, trying to kill him for no reason. Trying to cough up blood, he promised that he would not remain indebted to the hero if he helped him. The boy cold-bloodedly analyzed the newcomer to understand, was he a decoy or not? However, the wounds on his body looked quite real, so it was not so hard to believe his story. Moreover, there were only 3 pursuers behind him, clearly united into one group. Bu-eun's soul did not want to get involved in this trouble. However, it would be extremely problematic if someone found out his location and informed others. And at that moment, as if out of nowhere, a hollow in the ground appeared before them, capable of hiding them from the pursuers. When the trio of pursuers finally appeared in the clearing, they could not find the boy who had quickly escaped from them. Of course, they were angry, because they wanted him to be their first victim in this trial. However, since no one was nearby, they went to look for new prey. As soon as everyone scattered, the hero immediately climbed out from under the ground, and right after him, the boy he saved climbed out too. He was very grateful to the hero for his rescue, not even knowing how to thank him. Without Bu-eun's soul, he definitely would have already said goodbye to life on this cursed day. The hero, looking around the pit, realized it was created not only to hide. This means that Master Sa specially prepared it for him. Being inside, the young man felt how incredibly quickly his beast trail senses caught the sounds of footsteps on the ground, as well as the sounds of sword fighting. Literally every vibration reached him with crystal clarity. The situation became so clear to him, as if he saw everything with his own eyes. So the hero assumed the master wanted to teach him that the beast trail uses ground vibrations to detect enemies, even those hidden from sight. At that moment, the hero calmly looked at the boy from the school with a demanding, testing gaze, causing his body to betray him with a tremble of fear. However, trying to hide his panic, he hurried to introduce himself. This young man was named Gyeom Cheol-yeon. He was from the Bloody Sect. After that, he decided to find out the name of his generous savior. However, the hero did not tell him. The protagonist immediately turned around and went about his business, not wanting to waste time on empty talk. And, of course, Gyeom Cheol-yeon followed him like an annoying shadow. He hurried to explain. When the 3rd trial began, he immediately went into the forest, but everyone kept attacking and chasing him, which scared him a lot. The boy wanted at least to just travel alongside the hero, since Bu-eun's soul even hid him from enemies. So Gyeom Cheol-yeon thought, maybe he could trust him. Bu-eun's soul did not answer this question, calmly turning away from the annoying boy. However, the good-natured young man from the Bloody Sect decided that it was silent consent. Therefore, he joyfully ran up to his comrade to now travel together with him. Only for a moment, a somewhat strange smile appeared on his face, no longer as good-natured as it had been all this time. Soon the 2 reached another fairly open glade. The hero, placing his hand on the ground, tried to sense the vibrations around. Thus he understood. They would have to go around, for not far from them someone was fiercely fighting. Gyeom Cheol-yeon himself very much wanted the hero to teach him to also feel vibrations, as this talent was incredibly useful in battle. Bu-eun's soul said nothing and began to leave, but suddenly he heard words in the distance. Someone swore to take revenge for their brothers no matter what. And this sharp feeling of vengeance was well known to the young man, as if the entire atmosphere around was soaked with it. Of course, Gyeom Cheol-yeon immediately noticed. The hero's face suddenly changed, despite nothing seemingly having happened. However, he coldly explained. He decided to slightly change the plan and still join the fight he heard ahead. In the end, they cautiously crept through the bushes to see the fighters without revealing their presence. No one knew that at that moment an ambush was already being set above his head. However, when the young assassin attacked the hero from above, he easily stopped the strike, using his blade to block. Of course, the killer was shocked by the opponent's reaction, for the hero blocked his deadly technique of the forbidden extreme invisible art. So, looking at the enemy's skill, he even involuntarily took Bu-eun's soul for a professional assassin like himself. However, the hero did not say a word. With just one attack from the 13 forms of Hua Wu, he cut the enemy's body in half like a sheet of paper. In fact, the young man knew perfectly well. This opponent was strong, as his presence concealment skill was incredibly good. If Bu Sol had not mastered the beast trail skills, he would have had to struggle longer with this dangerous enemy. After that, the hero returned to tracking, and immediately began peeking out from behind the bushes. With the help of the beast trail, he felt the people there were still fiercely fighting. So he was extremely curious. If he helped the fighting guy, would he feel satisfaction from revenge? Realizing that their opponent was already too weakened by wounds, the attackers decided they only had to finish him off quickly. As a sign of respect, they even promised to kill quickly, without unnecessary suffering.
However, they could do nothing, because at that moment the hero single-handedly jumped into the fight, attacking a whole crowd of enemies without a trace of fear.
Of course, everyone was stunned when they realized the guy they were about to kill had actually managed to call his friend here for help. However, overall, they did not see this as a problem, considering it just another riffraff that needed to be killed on the way.
However, they did not expect at all. This so-called riffraff, immediately after engaging in the fight, would already kill 2 of their comrades with lightning-fast strikes. At that moment, another enemy charged straight at the hero with a furious scream. However, he did not even manage to do anything before he, bleeding profusely, collapsed lifelessly to the ground. This murder was committed by the very guy whom Bu Sol had engaged in battle to save him from certain death. But his hand was half severed, the wounds on his body were too deep and bleeding heavily. So the dying man gathered his last strength to deliver a final blow to his tormentor. After that, losing consciousness from blood loss, he died with a smile on his lips, rejoicing that he managed to complete his revenge, even at the cost of his life. At that moment, Gyeom Cheol-yeon noticed Bu Sol had finally finished his fight, dealing with everyone. He began enthusiastically praising his friend's incredible skills, patiently waiting for him to release the sword from his hands and relax. And at that moment, using a weapon resembling a large needle, he decided to stab the boy so that he would no longer relax, despite his high level of martial arts. But in the end, the traitor could do nothing. For although the blade was not in the youth's hands, he swiftly picked it up from the ground and then executed a flawless block. Immediately after that, the enraged hero attacked Gyeom Cheol-yeon, realizing, because of this treacherous bastard, he could not ask the deceased the last question about his revenge. Of course, in Gyeom Cheol-yeon's eyes, the reason for the hero's rage seemed super silly and ridiculous. Moreover, the traitor wanted to know, when did Bu Sol realize that he was planning to treacherously kill him? However, for the hero, everything remained obvious from the very beginning. Last time, when they were hiding underground together, he clearly understood that the boy had hidden a lot of weapons. It was hard not to notice this, given his constrained movements. The body betrayed that the young man was hiding something at waist level. The only reason Bu Sol did not expose him immediately, even knowing the truth, was his interest in the methods used by this young trickster. Moreover, the experienced warrior thought that observing who tries to deceive him would be very useful for future battles. And of course, Jim Chkol-yen went mad at such impudence. After all, he believed he had played his role flawlessly. In the end, the young man attacked, but none of his hidden blades managed to even scratch the enemy. And then Jim Chol-yen finally began to realize what he had felt about this guy all this time. The opponent seemed to predict every one of his moves. The young killer was very close to the truth. In the end, having come close in just one attack, the hero wounded the boy in the shoulder, causing scarlet blood to immediately flow down his body. Samjae Bu Sol, seizing the moment, picked up the hidden weapon from the ground to examine the needles more closely. Although this weapon was skillfully made, it became completely useless if the person being targeted knew about the hidden arsenal. And of course, the enraged boy immediately rushed at the hero after these words, ready to destroy him even at the cost of his own life. However, in the end, it all ended with his own death. Without even making special efforts, the master parted with this enemy, inflicting many wounds with his blade. With a lightning-fast movement, he hid his sword in the sheath, and at that very moment, the lifeless body of the opponent collapsed to the ground. Only after that did the hero manage to see the hidden weapon in more detail, realizing that if he had not noticed it earlier, he could have had serious problems up to fatal wounds and defeat. Moreover, what is most sad in this situation, he saw in the eyes of Jim Chol-yen a fading spark of life. The young man was clearly someone who wanted to live, but still Jim Chol-yen was very different from the guy the hero saved. In the last moments of his life, he wanted to ask, what does a person feel when they complete their revenge? Besides, he wanted to know if after avenging his grandfather, he could also die peacefully with a smile on his face. In the end, Bu Sol decided to take the sword of the fallen boy as a reminder of this moment, after which he left. He did not know that all this time he was being closely watched from the shadows. The pursuers themselves saw that the young man used the basic sword technique of the Hua sect, which is not highly valued in real combat, and could not even kill an assassin. So, despite the observers considering him quite impressive,
there were plenty of recruits with talents like his. So if the hero does not raise his level, surviving in hell will be incredibly difficult for him. Thus the hero's trials continued, and the next day he was already running for his life from the pursuit. Many test subjects chased him to prevent Bu-eun's soul from escaping and killing him. They attacked with various weapons, and so far the hero managed to successfully avoid enemy strikes. However, the guy who wielded a metal whip still managed to hit him with a strike to the back. And since this trio still did not fall behind the hero, Bu-eun's soul realized that if he continued just running from them, he would soon simply run out of breath. So he urgently needed to come up with some plan. At that moment, at the highest point of the island, watching everything happening, stood the Golden Blade together with his assistant Jin-gak. He decided to find out what the situation was among the test subjects, and it turned out that out of 86 people, only 41 remained alive. By that time, only 3 days had passed, so the Golden Dagger was even somewhat surprised that more than half of the test subjects had died. That means only worthy specimens surely remained in the exam, and he wanted to see how their skills would unfold. After that, he demanded that his subordinate give him the map he had kept with him all this time. At that moment, the hero continued fighting, delivering a couple of blows to the opponents. And although he ultimately lost his sword, he managed to disorient the enemies and escape again. Based on the characteristics of the enemy's weapons, it was obviously completely disadvantageous for him to fight them in open space. So at first he decided to go to an area where the space was much narrower so that the enemies would be right in front of him. He did not suspect that at that moment the Golden Dagger decided to reduce the territory for the fighters, and his gaze fell on the Hua Battle Hall where he had ordered the ghosts to be released. The hero ran into this hall, and soon after him also followed his pursuers. Enemies, wandering through the corridors, kept trying to find where Bu-eun's soul had gone, and even mocked him. After all, he was like a rat hiding in the corners. One of the leaders warned that no matter how far the fugitive tried to run away, he would still die, so he suggested that he come out of hiding. He did not even know that the boy was already behind his back. After all, the warrior did not intend to hide in principle. However, unfortunately, the enemy managed to evade the surprise attack. Moreover, he mocked the hero, as such pathetic tricks could not corner him in any way. He threw his throwing secret weapon to the side of the hero, from each attack of which he easily dodged. And of course, the guy was furious that the hero read all his moves, but he couldn't stay angry for long, as the hero instantly slit his throat with his sword. Immediately after that, he rushed at the others who were using long metal whips to attack. They immediately began to attack, but unfortunately they were too slow, so another one of them lost his hand. Only then did the finally gathered group of survivors realize that this guy had deliberately lured them here. All because in the confined space, the formation of the squad White Horses lost its power. Their strength significantly decreased, and the direction and options of techniques became easily predictable. Moreover, individually none of the guys posed a serious threat, so he decided to deal with them one by one. Fortunately, the narrow corridor structure allowed him to do so. However, unfortunately, he was still hit by another attack. A whip that bounced off the wall and struck the young man in the stomach. Obviously, while he was lying on the ground, the others considered it the perfect chance to survive and rushed to run to the exit. However, they ran into a warrior who was guarding that exit. He warned the guys that they better not even try to escape, since it was a disgrace for the followers of the demonic path. He was the leader training these guys. So they hurried to explain that they wanted to leave because it would simply be inconvenient to fight in the martial arts hall. However, hearing these words, the leader personally killed them all, realizing that he should not have taken weaklings under his wing who had not even reached an advanced level. At that moment, a hero emerged from hiding, who immediately understood that this man was the leader of those guys. And he honestly admitted that he was very impressed by Bu-eun's soul's skills, and learned that the techniques he had used earlier were techniques of the Hua sect. Right after that, he introduced himself to the young man with a smile, after which he wanted to know the hero's name. But instead, Bu-eun's soul could not understand why the man killed his own disciples. He only laughed contemptuously at such a stupid question, realizing that he did not need to know the name of the one who was about to die. Immediately after that, he took out his lasso and attacked the young man, breaking the weapon the boy had wielded all this time with it. The leader explained with a smile that he had heard that at the advanced level of the Hua Hall, the kids were taught only one sword technique, and that was a defensive one. However, Bu-eun's soul wanted to know how the man knew this. Perhaps he had some network of informants that the hero was unaware of. And obviously the leader noticed how the young man became thoughtful right in the middle of their fight. After that, he attacked again and destroyed absolutely everything he touched, be it a wall or a person. With this man, there was really no advantage in fighting indoors, since the hero had fewer maneuvers to avoid attacks. Finally, the hero managed to fend off another attack, after which he gripped his blade more firmly, ready to continue the battle. However, the leader realized with disappointment that the boy's terrible sword technique would never withstand the power of the White Horse with 9 Tails style. Immediately after that, he got seriously enraged, so his whip began moving in all directions at once, confusing the enemy. He himself laughed madly, realizing that very soon the white horse's whip would take the life of this boy. The hero tried to analyze the enemy's attack and realized that the defensive style he had learned at the advanced level of the Hua Hall would not be able to block the attacks. After all, he did not have enough strength to break the horsewhip. However, he remembered something he was taught in the beginner, and especially in the intermediate hall. By this time, the whip was already coiling from all sides, and the leader noticed how the boy kept struggling to the last, trying to break free from this iron prison. Of course, he tried to explain to the boy that his pathetic technique would not help at all. However, very soon the young man managed to break this ring circle, finally escaping from the captivity of the iron whip. Immediately after that, he rushed at the opponent, using the intermediate hall technique, Extreme Lightning Strike. The man did not realize until the last moment that he had been mortally wounded by this enemy technique. Moreover, due to the size of the slashed wound, he did not even feel pain because of the shock. But very soon, bleeding profusely, he lost consciousness on the cold ground, allowing Bu-eun Sol to finally catch his breath and recover. As the intermediate hall instructor told the boy, his sword technique was indeed a very dangerous style, but at the same time it was the most powerful attack he was currently capable of. However, obviously using it again would not be easy. But he was still very lucky to have learned this technique in the intermediate hall. But by then he had already spent too much time. The limited zone would soon change, so he needed to leave. In the next moment, Bu-eun Sol felt a wave of ominous energy rolling over him from behind. Thick, oppressive, like a shroud of death. It was a guardian ghost, appearing to close another forbidden zone and eliminate the disobedient students who dared to linger here. This meant one thing. Right during their fight, this place turned into forbidden territory. But he did not come here to run from battle and cling to life at any cost. So everything must be resolved. With this thought, the hero decisively stepped forward, towards the ghost. However, no reaction followed. The guardian remained motionless, like a statue. Then Bu-eun Sol realized his chance. He just needed to slip past, taking advantage of this lull. He dashed to the exit, bypassing the ghost. But barely level with the guardian's figure, the young man felt a blow of such monstrous force that his entire body was instantly shackled by invisible chains. He didn't even have time to turn around to defend himself. The blade was already tracing a deadly arc toward his neck. In that last moment before inevitable death, animal instincts took over reason. Bu-eun Sol ducked, obeying pure animal intuition, and saved himself, sacrificing only a lock of hair cut by an invisible blade. But what frightened him most was something else. He didn't even feel how exactly the ghost struck. Without the beast's path, death would have come instantly, leaving no time even for a final thought. There was no choice left. Bu-eun Sol turned to face the enemy, deciding to keep every movement under close watch. Too late he realized his mistake. The ghost's outward calm deceived him. But as soon as the young man moved beyond the forbidden zone, the guardian struck lightning fast. The master saw instructions surfaced in his memory. When predators hunt herbivores, they do not always win by speed. After all, the prey can run in zigzags, making it harder to catch. And yet the excellent beast invariably succeeds in the hunt. The secret is simple. The predator times its attack to coincide with the prey's movement, turning its maneuver into a trap. Bu-eun Sol learned this lesson. He dashed to the side, trying to move as unpredictably as possible. At first, he made deceptive zigzags, and the ghost immediately blocked his path, standing like an impenetrable wall. Right after that, the young man dodged the strike with a somersault and bounced back, using the power of the beast's path. Now he had to force the enemy to reveal himself with some unforeseen move. However, On understood he was late. The ghost had already pressed the tip of the sword to his throat. But at the last moment, the guardian froze and hid the blade in its sheath. Bu-eun Sol still managed to jump beyond the forbidden zone boundary. However, in the end, he only managed to escape. If he met such an enemy face-to-face in open terrain, he would not be able to oppose anything. Bu-eun Sol could confidently say, this ghost was a true master of the highest level, which means his own skill compared to this was insignificant, like a drop before the ocean. Only when the sun finally disappeared below the horizon, coloring the sky with crimson reflections, did Bu-eun Sol finally stop to catch his breath and reflect on the encounter with the ghost. He saw firsthand the skills of true masters, an incomparable, unattainable level. And that means the monster that killed his grandfather surely possessed a similar terrifying combat power. To defeat such an enemy, the hero had to surpass himself many times over. While the young man was catching his breath, he did not notice how another warrior had settled nearby, calmly sitting on a stone and wiping his bloodied sword. He quickly recognized Bu-eun Sol. He had been looking for him for a long time, having heard that this boy had managed to study the legendary beast path. The hero himself was struck that the stranger spoke to him so familiarly, as if they were old acquaintances. Apparently, this warrior also participated in the information network, like that guy with the whip, killed by his own leader. The young man stood up, intending to introduce himself, but changed his mind in the process. He saw no point in introducing himself to the warrior he was about to kill. A dead man does not need to know the name of his executioner. Immediately after that, he attacked. However, Bu-un-sol did not even flinch. He easily dodged, having calculated the trajectory of the enemy's blade. Honestly, the young man was amazed. Thanks to animal instincts, the opponent instantly predicted the sword's movements. He could very well become one of the candidates for the position of master of the demonic sect.
But this was just another reason to get rid of this dangerous seed right here and now.
He continued the fight, but the technique of his sword changed radically. But Un-sol did not understand until the very end what the enemy meant by the seed of the demonic sect. Here he remembered the words of Oso Jinhui. Someone said that not everyone gathered here strives to become demonic masters. So this guy was a spy of the orthodox sects, but he could not be distracted from the fight. Suddenly, Bu-un-sol felt a strange force, as if sucking energy from his body. A childhood memory surfaced. How he, together with his grandfather, examined the corpse of a man killed by a Hebei-style blade. Grandfather immediately understood what technique it was. There were no external wounds on the body, but all the bones inside were shattered. It was the calling card of that school. Internal energy was infused into the victim's body with every contact of the blade. The old man was curious about what sin the man had committed to attract the attention of the Peng clan master, warriors who rarely appeared in the martial arts world. Putting two and two together, Bu-un-sol realized his opponent belonged to the Hebei Peng clan. The enemy was surprised by such insight and wanted to know how the young man managed to expose him. But Bu-un-sol remembered another well-known feature of this clan, a powerful absorption technique, one of the fundamental internal energy techniques. The method was cunning, drawing the user closer to the enemy, but it was like a double-edged sword, capable of injuring the attacker himself. Recalling all his grandfather's instructions, the hero aimed his sword at the opponent. Now there was no point for the enemy to hide. He introduced himself properly and promised that the Peng clan would destroy all seeds of the demonic sect. But the most amazing thing happened next. When he was about to attack, Bu-un-sol suddenly stuck his blade straight into the ground. Immediately after that, he dodged the strike, and the opponent, by inertia, slashed at the sword stuck in the ground. Using this moment, Bu-un-sol kicked the enemy in the side, then pulled the sword out of the ground. Looking at the crouched opponent pressing his palm to his ribs, the young man realized his plan had worked. The warrior of the orthodox sect was angry that the demonic spawn used dirty tricks. Bu-un-sol himself understood. Although the plan succeeded, the effect was not very powerful. Not surprising, the enemy's body had surely undergone many years of training, and the opponent had already found a way to minimize damage. The hero remembered the words of the advanced hall instructor about the technique of the late strike. At the moment of collision, the true speed was to be at least a fraction of a second faster than the enemy. Now, having turned the absorption technique upside down, it was possible to attack even more swiftly. It was necessary not to resist the pulling force, but to direct the sword straight at the enemy, only slightly changing the trajectory at the last moment. The enemy barely managed to defend himself. Otherwise, the sword would have pierced his head, sparing him from losing an eye. Only at that moment did the frightened orthodox disciple realize Bu-un-sol used the absorption technique against him himself. However, the absorption technique of the Hebei sect was powerful enough to attract even stones from afar. Even martial arts masters could hardly reasonably resist this power. The warrior was sure. The boy was definitely no obstacle. He attacked again, but it was all in vain. The stronger the absorption technique became, the faster and deadlier Bu-un-sol's sword became. The hero repeatedly avoided attacks and counterattacked. The opponent was furious. How many more times was this boy going to pull off his pathetic tricks? He attacked with full force, considering himself strong enough without special techniques. This was exactly what Bu-un-sol was waiting for. This was the best moment to use the first Hua sword technique, the deep mystic blade technique. The enemies clashed in the final battle, each using their best technique. At first glance, only Bu-un-sol appeared wounded. Many bloody streaks immediately appeared on his body. The whole point was that the opponent had received a mortal wound. He just needed more time to realize it. Falling to his knees, he finally understood that he had lost. Bu-un-sol hurried to explain. The Hua sword technique was a rather risky plan. He had to endure the damage from all the enemy's strikes himself. The orthodox warrior could never have even imagined that someone could interpret Hua's sword in such a way. But the most unexpected thing happened next. Bu-un-sol left him alive and simply walked away, considering that this guy had nothing to do with his revenge. The orthodox master was stunned. In his entire life he had met many fighters, but someone so interesting appeared for the first time. He could only hope that his paths with Bu-un-sol would never cross again. Such an opponent was especially dangerous. But as soon as the hero disappeared from sight, A ghost approached the wounded warrior, coming to kill him. The guard felt sorry that the guy from the Orthodox sect, a member of the Hebei Peng clan, despite all his strength, turned out to be so powerless in battle. Only at the last moment did the dying warrior realize the ghosts had known from the very beginning who he was, and still allowed him to be selected. That means he greatly underestimated the demonic palace, for which he paid with his life. At that time, things were no better for Oso Jinha. Hiding behind a tree, he was pulling countless needles out of his body. Honestly, the young man could not have imagined that among the participants there would be someone so virtuoso in handling poisons. In the next moment, the opponents discovered him. They only regretted the fate of the guy who caught the special needle of the hellish bloody fortress. The poison was so strong that without an antidote, the victim would sooner or later die a painful death. Then Oso Jinha fully realized, even though he was a loner, there are still moments when it is much better to have a partner. At that very moment, the girl with icy calmness warned the unlucky fighter. No matter how skilled a warrior he was, no matter what incredible skills he had mastered, using a sword with only his left hand against a crowd was absolutely pointless. The surviving left limb simply would not allow him to cope with the onslaught. So the only reasonable decision for him now was to surrender meekly and allow himself to be killed without unnecessary suffering. Immediately after these words, as cold as ice, a whole crowd of ruthless killers rushed at the defenseless man, showering him with a hail of throwing needles, shurikens, and everything that came to hand in the heat of bloodthirsty excitement. Despite the fact that the warrior somehow miraculously managed to fend off the barrage of merciless attacks, another poisoned needle still hit him straight in the arm, piercing the flesh through and through. This fatal hit meant only one thing. If he did not immediately take the life-saving antidote, he would soon pay for his carelessness with his own life, writhing in agonizing convulsions from the poison. However, when the unfortunate man was already mentally ready to accept inevitable death, he suddenly heard a piercing cry of pain that definitely did not belong to him. At that very moment, one of the attackers fell dead to the ground. Someone was clearly attacking the bandits from an ambush with lightning precision. And of course, this mysterious savior turned out to be none other than the hero who came to the defense of his acquaintance So Jinha, not abandoning him in trouble. As a result, the brief fight that ensued ended with stunning speed. All the scoundrels who attacked the traveler instantly paid for their audacity with their worthless lives falling under the Avenger's blade. This is it. At that very moment, the terrified-to-death fighter hastily threw the sword from his trembling hands and hurried to explain to the hero that he had no intention of harming him. It was all a terrible misunderstanding. However, the savior paid absolutely no attention to his pitiful excuses. Instead, the warrior began methodically searching the bodies of the fallen enemies. Finally, he found among the corpses the coveted bottle with the precious antidote hidden inside. Thanks to this find, the hero could now deal much more easily and effectively with the remaining degenerates of the hellish bloody sect, without fearing their insidious poisons. When the warrior was about to leave this place without looking back, the terrified Sojinha desperately stopped him, explaining in a trembling voice he had been poisoned with a deadly toxin. But Buyun Sol, with a stone-faced expression, hurriedly explained to the guy he had come here not to save anyone at all. His goal was to kill all the remaining participants, including Sojinha himself. He hadn't finished off the unfortunate man simply because he saw no practical sense in it at the moment. And basically, the young man deeply understood. The hero was absolutely right in his words. Even if the warrior mercifully gave him the life-saving antidote, Sojinha was still doomed to die eventually. However, the desperate guy had another, more tempting option to avoid death. He proposed to join Bu-Un's soul as an ally if he generously gave him the antidote and allowed him to survive. However, the boy still did not see a single compelling reason why such an alliance would be at all beneficial to him. Then the dying man hurried to explain the logic of his proposal. About 20 survivors remained, and besides the two of them, all other groups had already united into clans. No matter how incredibly strong a warrior the hero was, standing proudly alone against countless ruthless enemies was simply impossible. Numerical superiority would sooner or later crush him. But if he agreed to work together with Sojinha, who knew all the skills and weaknesses of the opponents, he would definitely gain an advantage in the upcoming battles. The warrior solemnly swore that if the savior preserved his life, he would never betray him for anything in the world. And indeed, from everything Bu-Un Sol remembered about this guy from previous encounters, he gave the impression of a somewhat proud and independent fighter, but by no means a treacherous traitor ready to stab someone in the back. The terms of the deal were extremely simple and clear. Until only the two of them remained in this bloody tournament, they would fight side by side, not directing deadly blades at each other. And in the end, after thinking over the benefits of this unusual alliance, the hero made a fateful decision and handed the boy the life-saving antidote. Of course, Sojin-ha immediately began pouring precious potion on his wounded hand to quickly remove the poison from his body before it was too late. However, the hero suddenly caught a painfully familiar ominous sound from afar. Another cursed forbidden zone appeared in this arena of death. The warrior hurried to urge the slow Sojin-ha to leave this doomed place immediately, not wasting precious moments. However, he could not understand the reason for such sudden panic in a hurry. After all, this zone was still formally not prohibited. But the hero hastily explained the simple logic. If the overwhelming majority of zones were already sealed, and suddenly another forbidden area appeared here, it means that very soon all the survivors will gather right here. But they no longer managed to escape unnoticed, for a huge bloodthirsty crowd had already surrounded the two with a dense, impenetrable ring of bodies and blades. Now it was hopelessly too late to escape by flight. The trap had snapped shut. However, among all the enemies surrounding them, one unusual guy immediately caught the young man's eye, clearly different from all the other ordinary fighters. In the end, the two warring factions that had come together saw no point in waiting for someone to attack first, losing the initiative. Therefore, one of the leaders suggested starting by getting rid of the wounded and defenseless too. They were well aware of the sinister reputation of Bu-un-sol, and had heard a lot about him, the young man who mastered the beast's path from the Nyangya pavilion. And it was known about Sojin-ha that his fencing was quite good. Moreover, the trickster carefully studied the combat skills of other students, searching for weaknesses, so underestimating this pair would be a fatal mistake. Moreover, it was obvious. These two stubborn ones never joined any groups until the very end, remaining proud loners. In the end, the enemies simply united everyone against them, creating a temporary alliance. At that tense moment, Sojin-ha calmly pointed to the bottle tied to the hero's arm. In this modest container was stored a powdered antidote, which he had very recently and generously handed over to the guy for salvation. However, he acted preemptively, presented the contents as the deadly poison of the bloody sect, and sharply threw the powder right into the unsuspecting faces of the nearest enemies. Of course, all the attackers immediately covered their faces with their hands in panic, firmly convinced that the legendary poison of the cursed bloody sect was in the air. At the same time, amidst the chaos, Bu-un-sol together with the resourceful Sojin-ha miraculously managed to escape the deadly encirclement, taking advantage of the confusion. Unfortunately, the most perceptive of the pursuers quickly realized the air did not contain poison at all. They had been shamelessly deceived. However, Sojin-ha was still immensely glad about this outcome. After all, the harmless powder managed to create a perfect smokescreen to break away from the chase and disappear into the chaos. Moreover, the open space was now completely disadvantageous for them tactically. They urgently needed to hide somewhere in the mountains, among winding paths and hidden caves. The hero was thinking exactly the same thing. It was necessary to find a cave that would play to their advantage in defense. And the warrior knew one very suitable one. It was a shelter with a narrow, easily defensible entrance, but extremely spacious inside, an ideal position for defense. The cave that Bu-un-sol confidently chose greatly surprised Sojin-ha with its thoughtfulness. It seemed the hero had seriously prepared for the trial from the very beginning, calculating all the options. So the legendary technique of the wild beast was clearly far from the last deadly trump card hidden up his sleeves. That was why the guy became even more interested to find out who exactly was the mysterious Bu-un-sol hiding so many secrets. However, to their greatest misfortune, as soon as they finally reached the cherished cave, a sinister dark fog suddenly appeared before the astonished fugitives. And from the swirling haze, one by one, ghosts began to materialize, who until that moment had been scattered across the entire area. This meant the cave zone had become forbidden. The area was sealed. This also unequivocally meant that the incorporeal guardians had been vigilantly watching their every step from the very beginning. They specifically made the cave a forbidden territory precisely when they saw that the fugitives rushed here in search of shelter, a real trap. However, fortunately, as long as they did not cross the fatal boundary of the mystical fog, the ghosts would not attack them according to the rules of the trial. And since they would inevitably have to fight the pursuers to the death anyway, Bu-un-sol reasonably considered this territory was by no means the worst place for the decisive battle. After all, behind their backs was a forbidden zone inhabited by ghosts. So it was like fighting in a narrow cave with a tightly closed exit. The enemies could only attack from the front. In the end, the cornered young men simply had no choice, so they armed themselves with their faithful swords, preparing to meet fully armed those who dared to come for their heads. Very soon, the bloodthirsty enemies finally gathered together, forming a threatening line in front of the two cornered but unbroken fighters. However, the warriors were filled with steely determination to fight to the end because they knew perfectly well, as long as the ghosts were behind them, if even one enemy carelessly crossed the fog boundary, they would be instantly and mercilessly killed. However, The overconfident crowd seemed not to have even thought about this danger in the heat of bloodthirsty excitement. So the attackers only contemptuously mocked the pathetic bugs who were only senselessly delaying their inevitable death. After that, the enraged horde rushed at them with war cries. Meanwhile, the Golden Dagger Overseer watched all this bloody action attentively and detachedly. Now the final battle of the tournament was unfolding, which was supposed to determine the 10 most worthy winners of this slaughter. The enemies used absolutely all available throwing weapons, treacherous poisons, everything that came to hand in a desperate attempt to overcome the defenders. But so far, none of the guys had been seriously wounded. They fought like lions. Now that So Jinha was no longer poisoned by the cursed blood sect's poison, he felt much freer and more liberated in the heat of battle, easily dodging attacks and killing enemies one by one with precise accuracy. Soon these two indomitable warriors, having dealt with another group of unlucky opponents, finally faced each other back to back. However, there were still too many enemies thirsty for their blood. The countless horde did not thin out. But So Jinha was completely exhausted. His breath was interrupted. So the warrior had already mentally accepted the inevitable. Here he seemed to die, fallen in battle. However, after these doomed words of his comrade, the hero Bu Un Sol suddenly remembered the dear face of his beloved grandfather, when he faded away with a peaceful smile on his lips, unafraid of the end. This painful memory instantly ignited in the young man an indomitable thirst for life. After all, he clearly understood that he could not die here until he avenged. In the end, the warrior, like a mad beast, began to attack fiercely, mercilessly cutting down every enemy who dared to approach him within striking distance. All those around finally realized how deadly dangerous this obsessed opponent was in his fury. Therefore, all the forces of the Alliance were immediately thrown in to kill him at all costs before it was too late. At that moment, the young man calmly placed his palm on the hilt of his sword, trying to sharpen all his senses to the limit, and move as his infallible animal instinct commanded, shutting off reason. Moreover, he suddenly remembered the wise words of his mentor, which reminded the boy he had already mastered the legendary art of swordsmanship, available only to the chosen. The young man applied this ancient art at the decisive moment, ultimately defeating 4 furious fighters who rushed at him with a single lightning-fast strike. However, unfortunately, being too absorbed in thinking about technique, he carelessly let an enemy attacking with bare hands without weapons get too close. His inhuman strength was so great and crushing that the sword began to crack plaintively along the entire length of the blade under the terrible blow of the iron fist, and the hero was thrown far back by an explosive wave of monstrous energy. Of course, So Jinha immediately panicked, fearing for the life of his fearless comrade, with whom he fought side by side. However, the enemies only laughed maliciously at this touching fright, firmly understanding Bu Un Sol was surely already dead, and only then did the boy finally realize the true reason for his comrade's panic terror. After all, he had been thrown straight into the very heart of the forbidden zone beyond the border of the deadly fog. At that fateful moment, the ghost guardian had already materialized right above him and prepared his ghostly sword to behead the daring boy with a single strike. However, not allowing this unjust execution, the overseer loudly shouted, calling the attention of all present. As if on cue, protecting his promising student, Master Sa appeared, blocking the ghost's path to the victim and preventing the guardian from killing the talented youth. Immediately after this stunning rescue, the boy, scared half to death, lost consciousness from the shock experienced, collapsing weakly to the ground. The overseer immediately drew a dagger and rushed to him headlong. He authoritatively ordered to bring the impeccable healer immediately, before the boy finally gave up the ghost. There was no time to delay even a moment. He did not care at all that he had unauthorizedly stopped the sacred third trial, violating the ancient order. The overseer solemnly promised to take full responsibility for such a daring decision before the superiors. All because he had finally found a true priceless treasure, a warrior with lightning-fast predator reflexes, an indomitable thirst to win, and an absolutely unshakable heart of a true fighter. Bu Un Sol was an uncut diamond of the rarest purity, who simply had no significant flaws, a true genius by nature, worthy to become the supreme holy demon. Soon, the gray-haired old man appeared to confess and report his unauthorized actions to the authorities. The leadership was extremely intrigued. Why had the Golden Dagger so boldly disobeyed direct orders? After all, the number of candidates who were supposed to enter the demon school's top 10 was exactly 10 chosen ones. And according to the pavilion chief's plan, 2 more were supposed to faithfully serve as the ears and eyes of the holy demon. In total, there were supposed to be exactly 12 contenders. However, the Golden Dagger boldly stopped the trial, although there were still 2 extra contenders left. Obviously, severe punishment for such a willful act would inevitably follow, but the man was mentally prepared for any consequences. The elder was also extremely worried before the arrival of the powerful envoys from the 10 demon schools, for he had no idea how they would react to such a blatant violation of ancient rules. But the old man perfectly understood. The eyes of the 10 demon schools were as sharp as his own, so they would definitely understand everything. Soon, after the bloody trial ended, the hero finally came to his senses. However, he awoke in a completely unfamiliar room, where a sharp smell of healing herbs and medicines lingered. He must have been taken to a place where the wounded participants of the tournament were carefully cared for. Moreover, all the wounds on his battered body had miraculously healed without a trace. Not only the external injuries, but even the internal traumas received from exhausting training. This clearly meant the doctors of the demon path were much more skilled healers than Bu Eun-sol had expected from them. After changing into clean clothes, he left the chambers to find at least one living person. The warrior immediately met a helpful servant, who respectfully greeted the young master and decided to escort him. When the hero entered the spacious hall, he saw many students who were carefree feasting in the dining room at that time, devouring incredibly delicious dishes with gusto. After that, he decided to ask the servant where they were. It turned out that this mysterious place was called the Heart of Hell. Obviously, Bu Eun-sol had never been here before during all his research of the territory. That is why the young man did not recognize this area at all. The servant himself respectfully asked the young gentleman to order any dish he wished. He could prepare absolutely everything the guest desired. However, the modest Bu Eun-sol asked to bring only 2 bowls of noodles. He ordered 2 bowls because he and his grandfather always ate noodles, and the second portion was just for his grandpa out of old habit. At that moment, So Jin-ha joined the hero's table, thinking the boy was a true noodle lover since he ordered 2 hefty bowls at once. After that, he was silent for a moment, and then thanked Bu Eun-sol for saving his life. If the warrior had not participated in that final battle, So Jin-ha would surely have become a wandering spirit, roaming through the clouds in the world of the dead. However, Bu Eun-sol had no idea what kind of salvation was being talked about at all. After all, he had just finished off an enemy who happened to cross his path. Therefore, So Jin-ha had to patiently explain. After the 3rd trial, there should be strictly 12 people left. However, the chief instructor unilaterally interrupted the sacred trial to save the hero, and as a result, 14 survivors remained. Therefore, So Jin-ha truly survived thanks to the hero and sincerely wanted to thank him for it. Moreover, he was quite surprised. Bu Eun-sol really knew nothing about what had happened. Although this is by no means strange, considering that the young man almost instantly lost consciousness. 4 long days passed since the completion of the trial, during which the hero could not come to his senses. However, they were incredibly lucky. In the heart of hell was a flawless doctor, who was also called the Mad Healer. Once he was known as a man with a divine hand and the greatest healer in all lands, but when he failed to cure his beloved's illness, he fell into madness from grief. Bu Eun-sol had heard of this legendary man. Rumor had it that he could save anyone still breathing, regardless of the severity of their wounds. It is no wonder that the warrior was now completely healthy. Perhaps, if grandfather had met this talented doctor back then, he would not have lost his precious life. After that, So Jin-ha decided to tell the hero absolutely everything he knew about the surviving guys. He brazenly took Bu Eun-sol's bowl of noodles and began a leisurely story, ignoring the hero's displeased face. However, what truly surprised the warrior was that those dangerous killer guys, with whom they fought to the death, turned out to be the elite sent by the 10 demon schools. They say demons choose their successors based on their evaluation. The hero quickly understood why the martial arts of the contenders surpassed even the skills of the instructors themselves. However, Bu Eun-sol still had no idea. Why did the Golden Dagger decide to save him, risking everything? Even So Jin-ha himself was extremely curious to know the true reason. He thought that Hekren-un decided to involve the boy in the War of the 10 Demons. Perhaps his school was somehow connected to the Golden Dagger, or had they met before? However, there could be no connection between these two. That made it even stranger. After all, the chief instructor was severely punished for his audacious act. As far as So Jin-ha heard, he left his high position and returned to the path of the swordsman. Hearing this, the hero could not understand at all. Someone who had nothing to do with him risked severe punishment and condemnation just to save his life? However, suddenly they heard a loud sound of a bell ringing throughout the entire building. So Jin-ha immediately stood up and led the hero with him. It was a signal for those who remained in hell. He indicated that the Supreme Council of 10 Demon Schools had arrived, whom they were to greet with honors. Soon Master Jingok lined up all the students to present them to the arriving lords. However, despite so many people entering the door, not a single step was heard. They seemed to move silently through the air like ghosts. The very first thing when the masters entered, the elder immediately pointed a finger at the hero. The head of the Death Behavior School division offered the boy to become the successor of their ancient school. However, very soon it became clear,
The old man was addressing not him at all, but the guy who was standing behind his back. He proposed to him to become the successor of the school of commanding death. The young man explained that he had only honed sword techniques and had never practiced the art of the spear. However, for the old man, it did not matter at all. He clearly saw that this young man was born to master the spear of death's command, since the boy trained his body and his talent was perfectly suited for studying the spear. Studying fencing, he would not have achieved greatness even with such strong bones and physique. So he immediately led the young man with him in order to henceforth teach him the entire art of the spear. After that, it was time for another old man to choose. He immediately introduced himself. This ancient elder was the head of the blood-hardened castle of 10,000 poisons. Everyone who heard his name shuddered with horror. After all, this legendary poison master was capable of killing all living things within a radius of 3,000 meters with just a wave of his hand. And of course, the old man immediately turned his keen gaze to the young man So Jin-ha, suggesting that he become the successor of the blood-hardened castle. Of course, the young man was stunned, even despite the fact that he had been called a genius all his life. He could not believe that they wanted him to join the castle that was preparing poisoners. The vice captain explained at that time, "The most terrible poison in the world is a poisonous heart." Even before the third trial began, So Jin-ha cold-bloodedly tried to use the girl from the training hall to kill all the other students. And when he failed to do this, he simply killed her to hide all the evidence. So Jin-ha tried to prove it was originally her idea, and she was the first to attempt his life, so calling it murder was an exaggeration. But the vice captain did not blame the young man at all. The fact that he could cold-bloodedly take many lives without hesitation for his goal means that his nature was perfectly suited for the art of poison. It was admirable. So, in the old man's opinion, So Jin-ha could consider himself a talented swordsman. But that alone was not enough to look down on the world of martial arts. Only the chosen ones can crush the world with blade and sword, and So Jin-ha had much more talent for poison than for the sword. However, compared to Bu Yun-sol, So Jin-ha did not consider himself chosen at all. After all, the hero told him that he first learned to wield a sword during the tournament, yet his abilities were not inferior to those of So Jin-ha, who had been honing his skills for 10 years. In that case, there was no choice. He decided to join the blood-hardened castle. Immediately after that, the old man withdrew, leading the student away with him. Now it was the turn of the head of the main school. The man hurried forward, closely examining the students. This was the current greatest demonic sword of the Flaming Rain clan. Everyone immediately held their breath. After all, this was the student of the previous clan master, the greatest demonic sword in person. Everyone was extremely curious about whom he planned to choose, and many secretly prayed that it would be them. However, the man turned his stern gaze to the boy Bu Un-sol. He had already heard about the hero. After all, many elders praised him. Moreover, the youth had inherited the technique of the middle hall instructor Jeon. The man eagerly awaited the boy's future achievements, for the martial arts of their clan were incomprehensibly deep and required diligent honing. However, looking at the other masters awaiting the verdict, the hero calmly explained he did not wish to join the Flaming Rain clan. Of course, the man was quite surprised by such a bold answer, and afterwards, he was seriously enraged that the boy dared to reject his offer. He spread his oppressive energy around, pressing the hero to the ground with crushing force. However, the warrior explained he had the right to refuse the given offer, but the man could not believe that someone would reject the main school's offer in favor of another. So he decided to find out. Where did he want to go? And the fact that Bu Yun-sol planned to go to the Nangya pavilion offended the leader even more. Of all places, he decided to go to the most despicable pavilion, which could be considered an insult to the main school. Honestly, this man was so furious that it seemed his aura alone was breaking the boy's entire body. It is not surprising. This man was the greatest demonic sword. However, Master Sa hastily stood up to protect the young man, shielding him with his body. But the leader was only more enraged. Some pathetic vice leader of the pavilion dares to block his way. The man himself hastily grabbed his sword, showing readiness to draw the blade before the demonic sword. And then the leader realized this man dared to be arrogant, thinking that friendship with the leader would protect him. The others clearly understood. If the demonic sword went berserk, other candidates could also get involved in trouble and be killed. The conflict had to be stopped urgently. Therefore, the young man in green robes who arrived hurriedly begged the demonic sword to slow down. After all, everyone was too angry, and the situation was getting out of control.